The mist hadn't lifted off the rock face yet, and the woman was already standing there, palm flat against cold stone, fingers tracing a groove that no wind had ever cut. Down in the valley, a man in a gray coat held a match to a stack of paper. He didn't watch it burn. He watched the window instead, out toward the bluff, and his hands were shaking. She'd been pushing the handcart up that slope since before first light. The wheels slid on loose gravel. She braked, pushed, slid back half a step, pushed again. On the cart were the notebooks of a dead man. From the track below, laughter drifted up, not loud, just loud enough to hear every word of it clean. She didn't turn around. Her hands were bleeding before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Her fingers stopped on the stone. She scraped 60 years of dust off whatever was underneath. There were letters there. Somebody had carved them by hand. And down in the bank, the man came up out of his chair. They buried Temperance Wray on a Tuesday. By Friday, the town had already decided what to do with his widow. That was how fast it moved in Harlow's Creek. Grief was a private thing for exactly 3 days. After that, it belonged to everybody. It belonged to the women at the wash line, and the men leaning on the feed store counter, and the old ones on the porch, who had opinions about everything and proof of nothing. Temperance Wray was 19 years old, as she had no money, no land worth the paper it would take to sell it, and a 14-year-old brother who needed feeding. Whether the town liked her plan or not, everyone had a plan for her life. Everyone except her, because she had already made her decision. While the town was still arguing over who should take her in, she was sitting in the back room of a rented house that wasn't going to be hers past the month. Reading her grandfather's notebook by a candle stub, she was rationing like it was food, tracing his handwriting with one finger, thinking about a clip nobody wanted. What happened next would prove every single person in that town right, or it would make them choke on every word they'd ever said about her. Stay with me. This one gets rough before it gets good. 3 days before the funeral, before any of it, there had been an ordinary Tuesday. That's the part that nobody talks about, not the burials. The Tuesday before Thaddeus had gone out at first light to check the fence line on the north pasture. Routine. Boring. The kind of chore a man does 10,000 times in a life and never once thinks might be the last one. The horse spooked. Nobody ever figured out what. A snake, maybe, a shadow moving wrong. It didn't matter in the end, because the why of it changed nothing about the after of it. He went down hard against the fence post. Temperance found him 2 hours later when he didn't come in for the midday meal. He still the yard sound sometimes, not his name, not a scream. Just the particular quiet of a yard that should have had a man's voice in it and didn't. She didn't tell anyone about that quiet. She didn't tell anyone about a lot of things that year. Because grief, she was learning fast, is not a story you get to tell the way you want to tell it. It's a story other people tell about you, and they get to decide which parts matter. The morning they buried Thaddeus, the sky over Harlow's Creek was the color of a nail head, flat, gray, pressing down like a hand that didn't want to let go. Temperance stood at the graveside with her spine straight and her eyes dry, and people noticed that. They always notice the dry eyes. Nobody notices the 3 nights before, alone, when she cried so hard her ribs ached and there was nothing left to cry with by the time the sun came up on burial day. She'd used it all already, which left her hollow and quiet and thinking straighter than she had in months. Ezra stood beside her, 14 years old, already taller than she was, which still surprised her some mornings. He wore his father's old coat because it was the only thing warm enough for an October wind, and it hung wrong on him, too wide in the shoulders, and it made him look like a boy playing dress-up in a dead man's clothes. Because that's exactly what it was. He didn't cry either. He just stood there with his jaw locked light, the way it got when he was working hard not to feel something. In front of people who'd talk about it later, Temperance reached over, squeezed his arm once. He didn't pull away. The preacher said the words a preacher says. People bowed their heads on cue. And then it was done, the way these things are always done. Too fast for what they're supposed to mean, and somehow also endless. After the town gathered in Ruth Calden's side yard for the burial supper, because that was the custom, and customs don't care whether you want them, You Tumpitstutz, you said the shorn teeth and two leet pits. Take her hands. Let's them are the words they'd rehearsed on the walk over. Accepted the condolences. Deflected the plans. Ruth got to her first. Ruth ran the boarding house on the east side of town, and she had the kind of grip that meant business even when her voice was soft. There's always a room for you here, dear, Ruth said, holding both of Temperance's hands like she might run. You and Ezra, you don't need to worry about a single thing. That's kind of you. You'd work the kitchen, of course. I've needed someone reliable since my girl left in the spring. I appreciate the offer. It's a good arrangement, Temperance. Stable, safe. Temperance let the silence sit there just long enough to be polite. I'll think on it, she said. She would not think on it, she already knew that, but you don't tell a woman holding your hands at your husband's funeral that her kindness is a cage with good intentions. You just let her believe you're thinking. Ruth wasn't the only one with a plan. Because a plan for Temperance Wray had apparently become the town's favorite hobby. And the man considers himself head coach of that particular sport found her by the fire an hour later. Warren Latch. He ran the only bank for 30 miles, and he'd worn the same gray coat to every funeral in Harlow's Creek for 11 years. Like it was part of the job, broad through the shoulders. Face set in a permanent expression that suggested the whole world was disappointing him slightly, all the time, in ways he was too dignified to name out loud. He didn't offer condolences at first. He never did. Mrs. Wray, he said, I understand you're planning to sell the wagon. I am, and the mule. Not a question. Latch didn't ask questions when he already had the answer. He just said things out loud to see how she'd react to hearing them back. And the mule, she agreed. That's everything you have, more or less. Then what exactly are you planning to do? He said it careful, like he was handling glass, like the words themselves might cut him if he wasn't gentle enough. Temperance looked at him steady. I'm going to buy the Coro property. Latch went still. A pause, long enough that she thought maybe he'd just walk off. He didn't. The Bluff. His eyebrows moved a fraction, out past the eastern ridge. That's the one, Mrs. Wray. That land has sat unsold for 11 years. There's a reason for that. I know. You can't farm a cliff face. You can't build on it. The rock's near vertical in most places. The soil's maybe 2 inches deep where there's soil at all, and the nearest water is half a mile downslope in a dry season and worse in a wet one. I know that too. He blinked at her like she'd answered a question in another language. You know, my grandfather surveyed that land in 1861, she said. He wrote about it for years. He thought it had real potential. Latch's face did something complicated. Your grandfather, he said slowly, was most by openness to be. He stopped himself, which was in its own way a kindness she hadn't expected from him. Eccentric, Temperance finished. I know what they called him. I was going to say hopeful. You weren't, he almost smiled. Almost. Temperance. His voice dropped, the way a man's voice drops when he's about to say the true thing under the polite thing. You are 19 years old. You buried your husband 4 hours ago. This is not the day to make a decision based on a dead man's notebooks. She looked at him for a long moment. He caught her wrist, gentle, not rough, which somehow made it worse. Temperance. His voice dropped lower still. Your husband's note. It comes due in October. In full. I would have preferred to tell you this before you spent every dollar you had on a cliff. You didn't give me the chance. The fire popped somewhere behind her. She didn't turn toward it. How much? He told her the number. She didn't flinch. Not outside. Inside, something went still and cold. The way a lake goes still, right before the ice takes it whole, and nobody standing on the bank even knows it's news the moment it happened. And if I can't pay it, then the bank takes what's left. Which, as of this morning, isn't much. He wasn't cruel about it. That was the worst part. He said it like a fact about the weather world that had nothing to do with him personally, even though he was the man holding the number that would decide whether she had a roof come winter, because that's what money does to a conversation. It makes cruel to sound like arithmetic. October. Thank you for coming today, Mr. Latch. And she turned, and she walked away, which is not something people did to Warren Latch in Harlow's Creek. Not twice, anyway. Before any of that, there was the sale. The wagon went first. A trader named Foss came out to look at it, walked around it twice with his hands behind his back, like a man inspecting a horse's teeth, and named a number so low it wasn't really an offer. It was an insult dressed up as arithmetic. "That's not a fair price," Temperance said. "It's a fair price for a widow's wagon. It's the same wagon it was last week." Last week it wasn't a widow's wagon. She held his eyes a long moment, long enough that he shifted his weight. 40, she said. 30, 35. And you throw in the mule feed you've got sitting in that cart of yours. Foss looked at Ezra, looked back at her. Something in his face gave a little the way a man's face when he's decided the fight isn't worth the coin he'd save winning it. 35, he said. And the feed. Done. She didn't smile when they shook on it, because a smile would have told him he'd lost. And a man who knows he's lost negotiates harder next time. She just took the money, counted it twice, folded it into the cloth she kept against her ribs, under her dress, where nobody's careless hand couldn't find it in a crowd. The mule went 2 days later to Hollis Reed himself, who at least had the decency not to pretend he was doing her a favor. "Good animal," Reed said, running a hand down its neck. "Your husband kept it well." "He did. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Wray." "Thank you." He paid full price. Didn't haggle. Didn't need to say why. She understood it anyway. Some men apologize with their mouths, and some men apologize with their wallets, and she was learning fast which kind was worth more to a woman standing where she was standing. $30 That's what was left once she'd set aside 3 months of flour and beans and lamp oil. Everything else, the house, the furniture that wasn't nailed down, Thaddeus's good boots she couldn't bring herself to sell, and couldn't bring herself to keep either. All of it got sorted into piles. Keep, sell, leave behind. She bought the Coro property for $31.40. Every penny the wagon and mule had brought her, minus what she'd already set aside for flour and dried beans, and enough lamp oil to last 3 months if she was careful. Because she was going to have to be careful about everything now. The deed got signed on a Thursday morning in the county recorder's office, a narrow room that smelled like old paper and lamp smoke. The clerk was a thin young man named Wendell Pruitt, and he read the property description twice, looked at her, read it again. "Ma'am," he said, careful like he was breaking bad news slow so it wouldn't hurt as much. "This is the Coro Bluff land. I know what it is. I just bought it." He stamped the deed, handed it over, watched her walk out the door with an expression sitting somewhere between concern and disbelief, like he wasn't sure if he'd just witnessed a mistake or a miracle and didn't want to guess wrong either way. By noon, half the town knew. By sundown, the other half did too. And the opinions had gotten loud enough to reach her while she and Ezra loaded their last belongings onto a borrowed hand cart in front of the rented house. "I heard she's gone simple," a woman's voice said through the open window of the washhouse across the street, not even trying to whisper. "Grief does that to some people." "It's not grief," said a second voice. "That girl was strange before. You remember the way she used to walk around with rocks her grandfather gave her, naming what kind they were, telling anybody who'd stand still long enough, who does that? Somebody ought to stop her. She's got a boy to raise." Ezra was carrying a crate of books when he heard the last part. He stopped walking, looked at his sister. "Don't," Temperance said, not looking up from the rope she was tying. "I wasn't going to do anything. You were thinking about it." He set the crate down harder than he needed to. "They're not wrong that it's going to be hard. It's going to be very hard." She pulled the knot tight. "Hand me that end." He handed it over. Grandpa really believed in that land? He surveyed the whole eastern ridge 3 separate times, said the cliff face had the right kind of rock. Sandstone over limestone, with fracture lines running the way a man could work with, if he had patience and the right tools. Said there were water seams underneath that, surfaced lower down the slope, said. She stopped, smoothed her hand over the crate. He said most people look at a cliff and see everything they can't do with it. He looked at it and saw what nobody had done yet. Ezra was quiet a second. He also kept 14 cats and used to talk to the moon. "Yes," Temperance said. "He did, and he wasn't wrong about the rock." The Coro property was every bit as bad as Warren Latch had said it was, and it didn't bother pretending otherwise. The track leading up to the base of the bluff was barely a track, more like a suggestion carved into the hillside by Whatever foot traffic had gone up out of curiosity over the years, and then, having satisfied that curiosity, gone right back down. The slope was steep, loose gravel, dead grass that grabbed at the cart wheels like it was trying to keep them from making a mistakes it couldn't undo. By the time they'd wrestled the handcart halfway up, Temperance's arms were shaking, and Ezra was breathing like he'd run the whole distance. They stopped on a wide ledge about 2/3 of the way to the top, a natural shelf, maybe 30 feet across, where the slope leveled before the rock face rose straight up behind it. South-facing, that was the first thing she noticed. Her grandfather had written it down in his survey, 60 years back, in ink that had gone the color of weak tea. South-facing is spur. Excellent solar gain, protected from the north wind by the cliff itself. She stood on that ledge and looked down at the valley. Harlow's Creek was visible from here. Rooftops, the church spire, the brown thread of the creek that gave the town its name. In the low October light, it almost looked pretty. Almost. Because she knew what was under all that pretty. Clay-heavy soil. A water table that had been dropping every dry summer for a decade. Her grandfather had written about that too, and nobody in that valley had ever asked him to. "What do you think?" Ezra asked, coming to stand beside her. She turned to the cliff face, close to 30 feet at its tallest point, sandstone-colored, layered in horizontal bands with natural recesses, already carved into it by wind and time, places where the rock had pulled itself back into long, shallow hollows. She could see the fracture lines her grandfather had drawn on paper decades ago, running vertical, like slow cracks caught mid-motion and frozen there. "I think," she said, "we're going to be all right." Ezra looked at the ledge, at the cliff, at the single tarp they'd brought to sleep under until they built something better. "If you say so." He didn't sound convinced. He didn't argue either. That first night, they made camp under the tarp with a small fire built close to the cliff face, so the heat would bounce back at them instead of bleeding out into the dark. They ate beans out of a pot, didn't talk much. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said, argued, or buried that week. The wind picked up after dark and shook the canvas, hard enough that Temperance lay awake listening to it running through her grandfather's notebooks from memory, which she'd been doing since she was 12 years old, the way other girls memorized hymns. Cyrus Merrow had spent 30 years as a surveyor and geological observer before a bad back, and worse eyesight ended his working life. His colleagues called him a crank, called his fascination with old cliff settlements, how people in other parts of the world had built into rock faces and made those rock faces last centuries, a distraction from real work. As if 17 notebooks with careful drawings and careful math wasn't real work. As if the only thing that counted as real was the thing everybody else was already doing. He'd left all 17 notebooks to Temperance because she was the only one in the family who ever sat still long enough to listen to him talk. She'd carried them out of Harlow's Creek in an oilskin bag she'd sewn herself, waterproofed with beeswax, and she'd read every page of them so many times the paper had gone soft as cloth in places. Soft like something worn thin from being loved too hard. She lay under the tarp, wind shaking this above her, and she thought the same 4 words her grandfather used to say, over and over, until they'd worn a groove into her memory. Rock, water, heat, time. Get those 4 things right, he'd told her, and everything else was solvable. Everything else. She wasn't sure yet if that included a banker with a deadline in a town that had already made up its mind about her before she'd driven a single tool into the stone. She started on the rock before the week was out. Not the big work, not yet. First, she needed to understand the cliff face up close, the way Cyrus had taught her to understand anything. Slowly, with her hands, without deciding ahead of time what she was going to find. She went along the stone with her fingers, feeling the texture, pressing into the fracture lines to gauge how deep they ran, which direction they wanted to go. She tapped the rock with the handle of her grandfather's old geologist's hammer, the one tool of his she'd kept close her whole life, and she listened. Shumnis. In some places, solid in others, she marked where the stone was dense and stable, and where it was softer, more willing to be shaped. Ezra watched her do this for 2 days without saying much of anything. Then on the 3rd day, He picked up a chisel and started copying her a few feet down the face. "What am I listening for?" he asked. "A sound like knocking on a good door," she said. "Solid, dense. That's where we don't carve. We want the in-between. Where's the solid, but still sound." He tapped a while. "Here." She came and tapped the same spot. "There, mark it." He scratched a chalk line the way she'd shown him. "How deep does Grandpa say we can go?" "Into the natural fracture, maybe 12 feet. We don't need more than that for the main chamber. We're not digging a mine, Ezra. We're shaping what's already here." It took them 3 weeks to open the first chamber. 3 weeks of chiseling and hammering for hours a day, clearing broken stone by hand, arms and shoulders, screaming by nightfall so bad Temperance couldn't lift the spoon to eat it with, her arm shaking. They worked in 2-hour stretches, rested, went again. She kept a log of every inch they advanced, which tools worked on which layer, what angle the chisel needed to bite instead of skip. She adjusted as she learned the Bluff's particular temperament, because the stone had one, same as a person, and you had to learn it the way you'd learn a stubborn horse. The town noticed. Of course the town noticed. First the curious ones, standing on the track below the ledge, shading their eyes to watch 2 figures chip away at solid rock like they were trying to dig their way to China. Temperance could hear their voices drifting up, too far off to make out words, close enough to catch the tone. Then came the ones who weren't shy about it at all. A man named Purnell ran the feed store, had a voice built for carrying across 3 counties, called up from the track one afternoon while they worked. "How's the hole coming along, Mrs. Wray?" Ezra's jaw went tight. He kept Temperance to do. "My wife wants to know if you need candles sent up," Purnell called, grinning at the men beside him. "For the cave you're living in." Laughter. She heard it clean, even from up on the ledge. She set her chisel down and worked 10 more minutes before she responded to any of it, and when she did respond, she didn't shout back down at him. She climbed the path to the track and stood in front of Purnell with a calm that seemed to unsettle him slightly, the way stillness sometimes unsettles men who expect noise. "Purnell," she said, "how's the water table under your south field this year?" He blinked. "What?" "The clay layer runs shallow on that side, maybe 15 feet down. Last dry summer, I'd guess your well dropped by half. What's that got to do with?" "Nothing," she said, pleasant as Sunday. "I'm just curious about the geology." She turned, climbed back up. Behind her, she heard him say something low to the men beside him. She didn't catch it. She didn't need to. Ezra had watched the whole thing from the ledge. "What was the point of that?" he asked when she got back. "No point." She picked up her chisel. "I just wanted him thinking about something other than us for a night." By the end of November, the first chamber was roughed in, 8 feet wide, 11 deep, 6.5 at its tallest point, which was tight but workable, and enclosed on 3 sides by solid rock. They'd framed the open face with salvaged timber pulled from a barn that had half collapsed on lower slope years before nobody claimed. It wasn't comfortable. It was warm. The stone held the day's heat through the night, in a way Temperance had read about in Cyrus's notes 100 times, but hadn't understood until she was lying inside it and it, outside temperature dropping below freezing, and feeling nothing colder than a chill against her face. "It works," Ezra said one morning, sitting up in his blankets, palm flat against the wall like he was checking a pulse. "It's actually warm. That's why cliff dwellings hold up in hard climates." Temperance said, already up, stoking the small cooking fire near the door. "The stone stabilizes the temperature. You don't fight the weather. You let the rock take it in and give it back slow." He sat with his hand on the wall a while longer. "All right," he said finally. "I believe you." She looked at him. "You didn't before." He had the decency to look a little embarrassed. "I believed you believed it," he said. "That's different." She laughed. First time since the funeral. The sound surprised her, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt like something she'd forgotten she still had in her. They were not entirely alone in the work, though help came from a direction Temperance hadn't expected. Not everyone who came up that track came to mock. Not everyone who came up came to help either. Some came just to look, just to confirm whatever they'd already decided. so they could go back down and tell it like they'd seen it with their own eyes instead of just their own opinions. Cole Denby came up in early December, a rangy man in his 30s who farmed 40 acres on the valley's north side and had a habit, well known in Harlow's Creek, of having a strong opinion about everything and the volume to make sure everyone knew it. He stood at the edge of the ledge with his thumbs hooked in his belt and looked at the half-built chamber like it had personally offended him. "Heard. We're serious," he said. "Didn't believe it till now. Now you believe it. I believe you're up here freezing in a hole in the ground. Don't know if I'd call that serious. Might call it something else." Ezra's hands went still on his chisel. Temperance didn't look up from her work. "Was there some things you needed, Mr. Denby? Or did you climb all this way just to say that?" "Just looking. Look faster. We've got work to do before dark." He didn't leave right away. He stood there a minute longer, the way men do. They're deciding whether their pride can survive walking off with nothing to show for the climb. "My father always said your grandfather was touched," he said finally. "Not unkind, just touched, saw things in the ground the rest of us couldn't see. He did see things. Rings. The kind of things a lonely old man sees when he's got nobody left to talk sense into him." Temperance set her chisel down, looked at him straight. "You'll know which kind by October, Mr. D. Same as everybody else." He held her gaze a second. Then he laughed. Short, not entirely unkind, the laugh of a man who respects a swing even when he thinks it's going to miss. "October," he said. "I'll remember you said that. Please do." He went back down the track, and Ezra let out a breath he'd apparently been holding the whole exchange. "Why do you keep doing that?" he said, giving them a date, a number, something to hold you to. Because a promise with no date isn't a promise, it's a hope. And hopes don't scare anybody, Ezra. Dates do. Otis Bramwell was 73 years old and had been a stonemason before his knees quit on him. He came up the track one gray December afternoon, cane in one hand, a skeptical set to his weathered face that looked like it had been there for decades, and had no plans of leaving. "Let me see what you're doing," he said. No greeting, no preamble. She walked him through the first chamber, explained her approach to the fracture lines, showed him the sketches copied from Cyrus's notebooks. He listened without a word, bending now and then to examine something closer, breathing rough from the climb. When she finished, he was quiet a long moment. "Your grandfather was right, the fracture lines," he said finally. "Most men would have tried to blast this, shatter the whole face, leave you with a pile of rubble and a headache. Working along the natural breaks is slower, but it'll hold." He looked up at the ceiling of the chamber. "You need to keystone that entrance frame before it gets any heavier, or it'll drop on you some night while you're sleeping under it." "I know," Temperance said. "I've been trying to work out the angle. I'll show you." He came back the next day, and the day after that. Never stayed long. His knees wouldn't let him. But what he taught her in those short visits was worth 2 weeks of trial and error on her own. How to cut a proper keystone arch. How much rock thickness to leave between chambers so the whole thing didn't come down on their heads. How to read the stone for the places that would surprise you if you trusted them too far. She asked him one afternoon, the two of them sitting on the ledge eating the noon meal she'd made. He chewed his bread slow before answering. "Because nobody else is." He took another bite. "And because your grandfather was the only man in this county who ever talked to me like I knew what I was doing." A pause. "Also because if you manage what you're attempting, I'd like to have seen it before I die." That was the whole reason. He never explained further. He didn't need to, because that's how it works out here. Nobody helps you for one clean reason. They help you for 3 tangled ones. And you take it. And you don't ask them to untangle it for your benefit. December brought the waterwork. Cyrus's notebooks described the geology of the eastern ridge in a level of detail that had made his old colleagues roll their eyes at decades ago. But Temperance had studied it so long. She could recite whole passages without looking. He'd marked a zone on the lower slope below the ledge where limestone came close enough to the surface to feed natural springs in wet weather. More than that, where the water table sat high enough that a hand-dug cistern, cut to the right depth and dimension, would fill on its own and hold what it filled. "We need a cistern at the base," she told Ezra. Down where the limestone shows, then. A channel cut into the slope to carry the overflow up here, using the grade so we don't need to haul buckets or run a pump. Ezra looked at the slope. That's a long channel, about 40 feet, through rock and clay. Clay on the lower stretch, rock near the top. We'll use split timber up high, stone line the rest. He studied the ground a while, working the geometry the way he did. He was better at seeing the physical shape of a problem than she was. She'd learned that about him these past months. She could read a notebook and understand a theory cold. He could look at a slope and tell you exactly where the water wanted to go. Like he had some private conversation with gravity. Nobody else was invited to. Grade angles down toward the south end of the ledge, he said. If we cut there, flow comes in low and we build a basin right into the shelf itself. That's exactly what I was thinking. He looked at her sideways. Are you testing me? I was agreeing with you, she said, which I know you find suspicious. He almost smiled. The cistern took 6 weeks. The channel took 3 more on top of that. Cold work, most of it. Hands cracked and raw by the time January turned toward February, but by then they had water. They didn't have to carry uphill bucket by bucket, and that changed the shape of every single day that followed, because carrying water had been eating hours they needed for everything else, and now those hours belonged to them again. It was in the second week of February, cold enough that the chisels stung her palms through her gloves. That Temperance found the page that stopped her cold in a way the weather never had. She was going through Cyrus's 17th notebook by firelight. The one she thought least ought. Most of it was survey math she'd already worked through a dozen times and committed to memory. But that night, working out the exact grade for a second channel that hadn't started yet, she flipped past a page she'd skimmed 100 times without really looking. And this time she looked, because something about the page was wrong. Not wrong like a mistake, wrong like a secret. There was a section near the back, 3 pages, where the ink had been scraped. Not torn out, scraped. Someone had taken a blade or a hard edge and worked at the surface of the paper until whole lines of her grandfather's handwriting had been lifted away, leaving pale grooves where words used to sit. Whoever did it had been careful, patient. This wasn't rage. This was someone trying to make sure a thing was never read again, and taking their time to do it right. She held the page up to the firelight, tilting it, the way you'd tilt a coin to catch a stamp worn thin from handling. Ghost words, barely there, more than a sentence. She could make out fragments. A date, 1860-something, the last number gone entirely. A name, half of it scraped clean. The visible half reading something like Lat. She stopped breathing for a second, because that could be but half a word could be anything. Latimer. Latrobe, 100 names started that way. Except her grandfather never scraped his own pages. She knew that the way she knew her own handwriting. He crossed things out with a single line. Sometimes wrote corrections in the margin. Sometimes just left mistakes standing because he said a wrong idea written down honestly was more useful than a right one that hid how you got there. He never erased. Which meant somebody else had gotten hold of this notebook at some point in the last 60 years. Sat with it. Decided 3 pages needed to disappear, and then put it back on the shelf like nothing had happened, trusting that nobody would ever hold it up to firelight at the exact right angle on a cold February night. 20 years after the man who wrote it was already in the ground. Ezra, she said. He was half asleep in the second chamber, but something in her voice brought him upright fast. What? Come, look at this. He came, looked at the page where she pointed, squinted. I don't see anything. Look at the surface. Not the ink, the paper. He tilted his head the way she had, and then he saw it too. The faint grooves, the missing weight of ink where ink should be. Somebody scraped this.
Somebody scraped this. Why would anybody care what Grandpa wrote 60 years ago?
Temperance stared at the page a long moment before she answered, because she didn't have an answer yet. She only had the shape of a question, and the shape of a question is a dangerous thing to hold too tight before you know what it's asking. I don't know, Fee, she said finally, but he surveyed this whole ridge 3 times. Wrote pages and pages on land nobody wanted, and somewhere in the middle of all that harmless, boring surveying, she tapped the scraped section. Somebody decided 3 pages were dangerous enough to Ezra sat back on his. It's dangerous. I don't know yet. Well, that's not. He stopped. Started again. That's not comforting. Temperance. It wasn't meant to be. He looked at the page a second longer, then back at her, and something in his 14-year-old face had gone older in the last 3 months than it had any right to. You're going to chase this down. Whatever it is. It wasn't a question, so she didn't answer it like one. She just closed the notebook, slow, careful with the spine, the way her grandfather had taught her to be careful with things that had already survived one lifetime and might not survive being handled rough in the next one. Get some sleep, she said. We've got a channel to fish. He went, she didn't. Not for a long while. Because the thing about a secret is, once you know it's there, you can't unknow the shape of the hole it left behind. She sat with the fire burning low, and the notebook closed in her lap and thought about Warren Latch's face at the funeral, the careful way he'd said her grandfather's name like it might still bite him after all these years dead. Your grandfather was considered by most people in this county to be. He'd stopped himself. She wondered, not for the first time that winter, exactly what word he'd swallowed. Springs came slow to the valley that year, the way it always did. A lot of promise and never quite enough rain to back it up. The creek that gave Harlow's Creek its name ran lower than folks liked to see in March. Farmers watched the sky, did their planting anyway, told each other it would come. It always came eventually, they said, the way people say things they need to be true more than they actually believe them. Temperance watched the creek, too, from up on the ledge. In the minutes between tasks, when she let herself stop moving long enough to notice anything beyond the next chore, she was tracking something Cyrus had written about. A pattern he'd observed. That's it, surveying the stretch of country. Relationship between snowpack in the northern mountains and groundwater in the valley by midsummer. The pattern this year was not encouraging. She wrote it down in her own journal. Didn't tell anyone in town. Nobody had asked. And even if they had, she wasn't sure yet what good the telling would do a valley that had already decided she was the strange one, cliff girl, the widow, who'd gone and buried herself alive out of grief, because that's what grief does to some people. But the deadline sat behind everything now, the way a held breath sits behind a sentence you haven't said yet. 12 months. That's what Latch had given her, standing by that fire at the burial supper, before she'd even had a full day to grieve without an audience. October to October. A year to build something out of nothing, on land nobody wanted, or lose whatever scraps were left once the bank finished counting. She hadn't told Ezra the exact figure, not yet. He knew there was a debt. He didn't know the size of the hole they were standing at the edge of. And some nights she caught herself doing the arithmetic in the dark. Ooh, over and over, the way you press a bruise just to confirm it still hurts. Some nights she wasn't sure which secret was heavier, the debt or the scraped page with half a banker's name bleeding through 60-year-old paper like a stain that refused to fully wash out. Because if those two things were connected, if Warren Latch's family had a reason, buried deep enough in the past that even her grandfather's care surveys had gotten scrubbed for it. Then the clock ticking toward October wasn't just about money. It was about something somebody had spent 60 years trying to keep buried, and she was starting to understand a hard truth about debts like the one hanging over her. A bank doesn't hand out a 12-month rope to a 19-year-old widow out of patience. Patience isn't a thing banks are known for, which meant either Latch believed she'd fail on her own, given enough time to prove it to the whole valley, or he needed the 12 months for some reason of his own, something that had nothing to do with her at all. She didn't know which, not yet. Until she did, she decided she would build like the 12 months were real, and the debt was the only thing standing between her and keeping this land, because that was the version of the problem she could actually put a chisel to. And she had just started digging. The first week of March brought a cold snap nobody had predicted. 3 days of hard frost that killed at the earlies. Shoots on Hollett's Reed's lower field and put half the valley in a foul mood, right when they should have been planting hopeful. Temperance heard about it from Otis, who came up the path with news the way other old men carried gossip, like it was a duty, not a pleasure. Reeds is furious, Otis said, settling onto his usual flat rock with a groan, lost near a full acre of seedling to the frost. Says it's the worst spring start he's seen in 11 years. 11 years, Temperance repeated. Why's that catch your ear? No reason. It caught her ear because 11 years was exactly how long the Coro Bluff had sat unsold. 11 years since everybody, had decided this land wasn't worth the trouble. She didn't believe in a coincidence that tidy. Not anymore. Not since the scraped pages. Otis watched her face a moment, the way old men watch young faces when they suspect there's a thought going on behind them that hasn't been shared out loud yet. You've got that look your grandfather used to get, he said, right before he'd say something nobody in the room wanted to hear. What look is that? Like you already know the answer, and you're just working out how to say it so it doesn't get you run out of town twice in 1 year. She almost laughed. Almost. I don't have an answer yet, Otis. I've got a question with the edges scraped off. He grunted, which was as close to sympathy as Otis Bramwell generally allowed himself. Well, he said, when you find it, I'd like to be there. By the middle of March, the second terrace wall was going up. Her first attempt, a bad one. She peeled straight, the way instinct told her a wall should go, and within 2 weeks it had settled wrong, the base cistern shifting under the weight of the soil behind it until the whole thing bowed like a tired old man's back. She had to pull it apart. Start over. This time, with Otis's words sitting in the back of her mind, the way advice does when you've finally been humbled enough to actually use it. Lean it back into the hill, he'd told her. People always want to build a wall, standing straight up, like it's daring gravity to knock it down. But a straight wall fights gravity, and gravity always wins in the end. Lean it back a few degrees. Lean it toward what it's holding. Then gravity's working with you instead of against you. She leaned it back. It held. You're not going to say anything? Ezra asked, watching her check the new wall for the third time that evening, running her palm along the stone the way you'd check a horse's leg for heat. About what? About being wrong. The first time. I was wrong, she said simply. Now it's right. That's the whole story. He looked at her a second like he expected more, some lesson, some speech, the kind of thing a grown woman was supposed to hand down to a little brother when she'd learned something hard. She didn't have one to give him, not that night. Hand me the level, she said instead, and he did, and that was the whole conversation. And somehow it said everything anyway. Because that's the thing nobody tells you about being wrong. You don't need a speech about it. You just need to fix the wall and keep building, and let the fixing be the lesson. Because words dressed up as wisdom mean less than a wall standing straight. The second time, when it fell down the first, the scraped pages sat in the oilskin bag through all of March and most of April, and Temperance touched them again. Not because she'd stopped caring, because she'd learned, in 19 years of watching her grandfather work, that some questions punish you for chasing them too fast. You let a thing sit. You keep your hands busy with the work in front of you, and eventually, if you're patient, the world hands you the next piece without your having to go looking for it half-blind. The world handed it to her on a Sunday in late April at the base of the cliff path in the shape of Warren Latch's own daughter. Her name was Beulah Latch, 17 years old, and she had her father's careful way of choosing words as before she said them, though none of his coldness in the choosing. She came up the lower track alone, which struck Temperance as strained before the girl had said a single word. Nobody from town walked up that track for pleasure. Mrs. Wray. Beulah stopped a respectful distance off, hands clasped in front of her like she was seeing herself for something. I hope you don't mind. I wasn't sure who else to ask. Ask me what? My father. She hesitated. He's been strange since the funeral. Since you bought this land, he doesn't sleep well. I hear him at night, going through the old ledgers in his study. Papers that go back further than the bank's even been open. Temperance kept her face still, the way she'd learned to keep still at 100 graveside conversations that winter. Why would that concern me? Beulah's eyes went to the cliff face behind her, to the chamber entrance, the terraces, the whole strange, stubborn shape of what Temperance had built out of $31 and a dead man's notebooks. Because he keeps saying your grandfather's name, Beulah said. In his sleep sometimes. And once, I heard him tell my mother that he thought this would all be over by now. What would be over? Beulah shook her head, and for a moment she looked less like a banker's daughter and more like any scared girl standing at the bottom of a hill she didn't understand. I don't know. I only know he's frightened something up here, Mrs. Wray. And my father doesn't get frightened of dirt and rock. He's frightened of people finding something out. The wind moved through the dry grass on the slope between them, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all, and Temperance felt the shape of the question she'd been carrying since February shift under her feet like ground that wasn't as solid as she'd believed. Thank you for telling me, she said finally. Beulah nodded once, quick, like she'd used up all the courage she had for one afternoon, and turned back down the track without another word. Temperance stood on the ledge a long time. After the girl had gone, the valley spread out gold and dusty below her, the creek running thinner than it should have this time of year, and she thought about scraped pages and half a name and a banker who didn't sleep, and she thought, this isn't just about the debt. This was never just about the debt. Something older than her marriage, older than her grandfather's grave, older maybe than the bank itself, was buried in that stone under her feet and in those pages. And Warren Latch had spent his whole adult life hoping nobody would ever climb up here and start asking the ground what it remembered. She was going to ask it anyway. Because that's what you do when everyone's already decided you're the fool on the hill. You stop trying to prove them wrong with words. You let the ground do the talking instead. That night, she took the notebook back out, held the scraped page to the fire again, tilting it slow, hunting the ghost of ink she'd found in February. Just that. 4 letters in silence where the rest of a name used to live. She thought of Warren Latch's face at the funeral. Careful, practiced. A man who had spent years learning how to stop a sentence half a beat before it became a confession. She thought of Beulah, walking a mile up a hill she had no reason to climb, just a stranger or to others in his sleep, which meant somebody in that house already knew something was wrong, which meant it wasn't only the dead who were keeping this secret with. Ezra found her still sitting with the notebook open when he woke before dawn. You didn't sleep. I slept some. That's not an answer. No, she admitted, it isn't. He sat down across from her, the fire down to embers, the cold stipsky to find its way in through the timber frame the way it always did in the hour before sunrise. Whatever this is, he said, it's bigger than a debt. I know. Are you scared of it? She thought about that honestly, because he deserved honesty more than he deserved comfort, and those two things weren't always the same gift. A little, she said. Mostly I'm curious. And curious is a stronger feeling than scared. The day is if you feed it right. 2 days later, she walked back down into Harlow's Creek, not for supplies, for paper. The recorder's office smelled the same as it had in October. Old ink, lamp smoke, dust, settled so deep into the floorboards, had stopped being dust and started being part of the wood. Wendell Pruitt looked up from his ledger and did a poor job of hiding his surprise. Mrs. Wray wasn't expecting back so soon. Off on old survey filings, anything on the eastern ridge. Anything with the name Merrow on it. Or Coro, that's. He glanced toward the back room, the one with the locked cabinet. Nobody but the county clerk had a key to. That's old material. Might take some digging. I've got time. He didn't move right away, Mr. Pruitt. It's not that I won't look, Mrs. Wray. It's that some of those files were reorganized a few years back. Reorganized, or he stopped himself the way Latch had stopped himself at the funeral, and Temperance felt something in her chest go very quiet and very alert, the way it did whenever Tomas Buddha this all second half of a sentence in front of her. Or what? Or gone through, he admitted, low, like the walls might repeat it. There was a fire in the archive room, back when I was a boy learning the job under old Mr. Aldous. Water damage mostly, but some boxes just weren't there after. Nobody made much of it at the time. When was this fire? He thought about it. Did the math on his fingers, the way a man does when a date matters more than he wants it to. Would have been the same year the bank changed hands, he said. Latch's father took it over from old Mr. Coro himself, matter of fact. Before that, it belonged to the family the Bluffs named after. Temperance stood very still, because course it wasn't just a name on a deed. It was a family whose land had gone from their own hands into a bank's hands, and whose name had gotten stamped onto a worthless cliff nobody wanted to buy for 11 straight years, right up until the year a fire happened to burn through the exact archive that might have explained why. "Mr. Pruitt," she said slowly, "what happened to the Coro family?" He looked at her a long moment, and for the first time since she'd walked in, he lowered his voice all the way down to something just above a whisper. "That," he said, "is a question I'd be careful asking too loud in this town, Mrs. Wray. Last man who asked it lost his position at this very desk. That was 15 years back. Nobody has asked it since. Until now." "Until now," he agreed, and something in his face. Reluctant, a little frightened, but underneath all of it, curious in a way he probably hadn't let himself be in 15 years, told her he was going to help her look anyway. She walked back up the track that evening with no new papers in her hand, only a name and a fire and a 15-year fierce silence sitting heavy in her chest like a stone she hadn't earned the right to put down yet. Ezra was waiting at the top, working by the last of the daylight, and he read her face before she said a word. "You found something." "I found a shape," she said. "Not the answer yet, just the shape of where it's hiding." He set down his tool. "What shape?" She looked past him, down at the valley, at the town, going gold and small in the fading light, at Warren Latch's bank, sitting square and solid in the middle of it, like it had never once had a reason to be afraid of anything. "The shape of a family that used to own this land," she said, "and doesn't anymore, and nobody in Harlow's Creek is supposed to ask why." The wind came up or cold across the ledge. Somewhere below, a dog barked twice and went quiet. 12 months, she thought. 12 months to build something real on ground. Somebody had worked very hard to make sure nobody ever looked at too closely. She picked her tool back up, because whatever was buried under this bluff, in the rock, in the scraped pages, in a fire that conveniently ate the one archive that might explain it all. It had waited this long to be found. It could wait a little longer, but not forever. And the ground, she was starting to understand, had been waiting a long time for somebody patient enough to listen. May came to learn of the valley wearing green it hadn't earned yet, because that's how spring lies to you out here. It shows up looking generous. Grass coming in thick along the creek bottom, wildflowers pushing through ground that had been frozen solid 2 months back. A man could look at a valley like that and believe the whole hard winter had been a rumor. Temperance Wray didn't believe it. She'd learned not to trust a season by how it opened, only by how it closed. Because she had a name now, Coro, a family that used to own this land and didn't anymore, and a fire that had eaten the one archive that might explain why. She had 4 letters bleeding through scraped paper, let and nothing after it. A name cut off mid-breath, like somebody had run out of nerve halfway through erasing their own guilt, and she had a date, October. 12 months from the funeral, down to the week. A debt with a deadline stitched right into it like a hem that couldn't be let out, which meant every single day mattered now in a way it hadn't before. Not just the days she spent on the bluff. The days she spent thinking about the bluff, because thinking, she was learning, could eat just as many hours as digging if you let it. She didn't let it. Not for long. There was too much to build. The second cistern needed finishing before the ground dried hard again. The terraces needed widening if they were going to feed two people through that Cyrus's old notebooks were starting to whisper might be worse than ordinary. And somewhere underneath all of that, quiet, patient, refusing to go away no matter how many chisels she put between herself and it, sat the question of what exactly Warren Latch's family had done to the people who used to own this ground. She worked. That's what she did with a question she couldn't answer yet. She worked until her hands stopped shaking from wanting to know and started shaking from the honest kind of tired instead. Otis Bramwell came up most mornings, the rest of him following half a step behind, like his knees needed a moment to agree with the rest of his plan. He'd taken to the second cistern site like it was his own, checking the angle Ezra had cut, running a thumb along the stone seams, grunting his approval in increments, so small you had to know him a while to recognize praise when it happened. "You're going in at the wrong depth," he said, one morning, not unkindly, the way a man stay fact he expects to be corrected with our judgment. Ezra straightened up from the pit, sweat already dark through his shirt, though the sun wasn't but an hour high. Grandpa's notes say 4 feet to the water-bearing layer. Your grandpa surveyed this ridge before the last big flood cut a new channel through the lower slope. Ground shifts, boy. Even stubborn ground. Temperance climbed down to look. Otis wasn't wrong. She could see it once, he pointed. A faint discoloration in the clay. A seam that hadn't been there in Cyrus's original drawing, or hadn't been visible from the surface when he'd made it. How far off? She asked. 1.5 feet, maybe 2. No. Otis agreed. It's not. Which is why I said something instead of watching you dig 2 extra feet of nothing and calling it stubbornness instead of pride. She almost laughed. Almost. Fair, she said, and picked up the shovel herself. They corrected the depth over 2 days of miserable, backbreaking work, hauling out clay that had already half set from the spring rain, and by the time they hit the true water-bearing layer, Temperance's palms had blistered through her gloves and started blistering the gloves themselves. But the seepage came up right where Otis said it would. Slow. Dark. Honest water, welling up out of ground that had kept it hidden for longer than any of them had been alive. Ezra stood over it a long moment, just watching it rise. That's the second one, he said. Quiet. Like he was talking to the water more than to her. Second one, Temperance agreed. Third one's going to be harder. Why? Because the third one's not on Grandpa's map at all. I'm guessing at it. Ezra looked up at her. You're guessing. I'm reading the ground the way he taught me to. That's not the same as guessing. Exactly. But it's not the same as knowing, either. He thought about that a second. What's the difference? The difference, she said, is what you do when you're wrong. Guessing, you shrug and move on. Reading the ground, you go back and figure out what you missed. I don't plan on shrugging much this year, Ezra. He almost smiled at that. It was becoming a habit between them, almost smiling. Neither one of them quite ready yet to let a whole smile out into a year that hadn't earned it. It was the second week of May when Jonah Kestrel came up the track for the first time, and Temperance almost didn't recognize him at first, because she'd only seen him twice before. Once she was a horse for a neighbor, once fixing a hinge on a chest she'd brought in for repair the winter before Thaddeus died. A quiet man, wide hands, a permanent smudge of soot along his jaw that looked like it had taken up residence there and had no plans of leaving, no matter how hard he scrubbed. He stood at the top of the path, with a canvas bag over one shoulder and an expression that suggested he wasn't entirely sure what he was doing there himself. Mrs. Wray. Mr. Kestrel. She set down her chisel. Didn't expect to see you up here. I heard you were working with your grandfather for old tools. He set the bag down, opened it. Inside were 3 chisels, longer and heavier than the ones she'd been using, proper forged steel where hers had gone soft with age and use. Those'll do for finish work. For the heavy cutting, you need more weight behind the blade. She looked at the chisels. Good work. She didn't need to pick them up to know that. What do I owe you? Nothing yet. Try them. See if they suit. Pause. He glanced at the cistern pit, toward the terrace walls climbing the slope behind her, toward the whole strange, stubborn shape of what she and Ezra had carved out of a season. Most men in that valley had already written off as wasted. I could sharpen your whole set while I'm here, he offered. Brought the kit. She studied him a moment. He looked back without any particular judge in his face, which she'd come to appreciate in a valley where most faces seemed to be working an angle even when they smiled at you. I'd be grateful, she said. He sharpened tools the rest of that morning, sitting on a flat stone near the cliff face, working steady and mostly silent, and when he finally stood to leave, he looked at the second cistern a long moment before he spoke again. You're going in at a bad angle, he said. Ezra, who'd heard some version of that sentence twice already that week, didn't even look up. This already fixed the depth. Not the depth, the drainage. Jonah picked up a stick, sketched a line in the dirt. At that angle, when you hit the water layer, you'll get seepage along the base, but you won't get a clean fill. You want a slight negative grade. Tilt it back toward the cliff. Water runs to the low side on its own, and you draw from one point instead of chasing it around the basin. Temperance looked at the sketch in the dirt, looked at the plan in her head, the one she'd been carrying around feeling reasonably confident about. She had thought about drainage direction inside the cistern itself. You've built these before, she said. My grandfather kept a farm on limestone country, up in the hill districts. We built 3 of them when I was a boy. He looked at the pit. I can help correct it now before you go much deeper. Won't cost more than an hour. It cost closer to 2 hours. But by the end of it, the geometry was right, and when the spring seam hit the following week, the water ran exactly where he'd said it would run. He came back 4 more times that month, never announced when he was coming, never explained why, exactly. Once he got there, he brought tools. When he brought tools, labor. When he brought labor, and sometimes he just came and sat on the flat rock in the evening, looking at the valley, not talking much at all. Ezra, suspicious of him the first visit, the way he was suspicious of most grown men who showed up unannounced, gradually softened. Helped along, Temperance suspected, by the fact that Jonah talked to him like somebody who knew what he was doing, which was not a courtesy most adults in the boy life had bothered extending since October. Ezra went into town alone on the last Saturday in May. For flour and salt and a length of rope they were nearly out of, and he came back with a bruised look around his eyes that he was working very hard to hide. What happened? Temperance asked, watching him set the sacks down harder than he needed to. Nothing, Azara. He looked at the valley a long moment instead of at her, Purnell's boy, and 2 of his friends. They said some things. She waited. About you, he said. About what we're doing up here. He stopped there. I hit him, he said finally. I shouldn't have. I know. But I was tired of it. She sat down on the edge of the ledge and looked at the valley, with him, the 2 of them quiet. Moment, the late afternoon light gone into dusty Osaka Creek that was running thinner than either of them liked to admit out loud. What did they say? She asked, though some part of her already didn't want to know. That you're not right in the head. That you dragged me up here because you didn't have anybody else left to control. That. He stopped again. Once more, quieter. That father would be ashamed of what you turned me into. Temperance felt that one land somewhere under her ribs, sharp and precise, the way only a lie dressed up as concern for a dead man could land. They don't know your father, she said. They didn't know him well enough to say what he'd think. I know that. I still hit him. I know. He looked at her sideways, bracing, she realized, for a lecture he'd clearly rehearsed arguing against on the walk home. She didn't give him one. Come here, she said instead. He came. Sat beside her. Look at the creek, she said. He looked. What do you see? He was quiet a moment, working it the way she'd taught him to work anything. Slow, with hiding, ahead of time what he wanted to find. It's low, he said finally. For May, it's very low. I've been tracking it against Grandpa's records. He saw this before. He wrote about what came after. Ezra looked at the creek, then at her. What came after? She looked out at the valley, at the farms, the town going about their evening with no particular reason yet to be afraid. A very hard summer, she said, and didn't say more than that, because she didn't need to. What she'd read in Cyrus's notebooks was specific to keep her up some nights. With fear, exactly, but with the particular weight of knowing something the whole valley below her didn't yet know to be scared of. So the fight, Ezra said slowly. It doesn't matter, does it? In the end. It matters that you're hurting, she said. It doesn't matter what a boy who's about to lose his own well says about you on a Saturday afternoon. That's noise, Ezra. Noise doesn't build anything, and it doesn't tear anything down either, no matter how loud it gets. He was quiet a long while. I hope you're wrong. About the summer, he said. So do I. The storm came in the final days of May, on a night that had given no particular warning of itself beyond a heaviness in the air that Temperance had felt in her joints since sundown, and told herself was nothing. It was not nothing. The storm broke a little after midnight, and it didn't build slow the way storms are supposed to build, giving a person time to brace. It arrived already furious, rain hard enough to hurt when it hit skin, wind that found every gap in the timber framing and turned it into a voice, low and constant, like the whole Bluff was groaning under a weight it hadn't agreed to carry. Temperance woke to Ezra shaking her shoulder. The cistern. voice cracking somewhere between boy and man. This channel's overflowing. It's coming up too fast. She was on her feet before she'd fully understood the sentence. Because that's what fear does to a body that's had practice with it. It moves you before your mind catches up to why. Outside, the world had gone to water and noise. The channel they'd cut to carry overflow down the slope had become a channel for far more water than it was built to carry. And it was cutting sideways now, eating at the bank they'd shored up with stone not 3 weeks before. "Get Otis," she shouted over the wind. "He's staying the night in the lower chamber." She didn't finish the sentence, because at that exact moment, a section of the retaining wall above the second cistern let go all at once. A grinding, tearing sound that didn't belong to weather at all, that belonged to something ancient giving way after holding on far longer than anybody had asked it to. And underneath that sound, thin and sharp and worse than the storm itself, a man's voice, calling out, not loud, just enough, "Otis." She was moving before she knew she was moving down the slick slope in the dark rain, blinding her. Ezra, somewhere behind her, shouting something she couldn't make out over the wind. She found Otis pinned at the base of the collapsed wall, a slab of displaced stone across his lower leg, his face gray-white even in the dark, even soaked through. "I'm all right," he said, which was the kind of lie old men tell when they're not. "You're not. I've had worse. You haven't, not at your age." Ezra reached them a heartbeat later, breathing hard and together. Temperance bracing her shoulder under the stone. Ezra the slab from the other angle, both of them screaming instructions at each other that neither one could fully hear over the storm. They worked the rock free enough to drag Otis clear. His leg was broken. Bad, even in the dark, even soaked to the bone. Temperance could see the wrongness of the angle below his knee, and something in her chest went very cold and very steady. At the same time, the particular calms that shows up only when panic would cost too much. "We need to get him to shelter," she said. "The chamber's flooding at the entrance. Then we carry him to the upper one." It took the better part of an hour, in weather that seemed determined to argue with every step they took, to get Otis into the driest of the 3 chambers and get his split into 2 straight lengths of timber and strips torn from a blanket neither of them could spare. He didn't cry out once, though his jaw was clenched so tight by the end that Temperance worried he'd crack a tooth along with the bone. "You should have let me lie there," he said. Once the worst of it was done, his voice thin but steady. "Old man like me, broken leg out here could have solved a lot of problems for you." "Don't. I'm not being maudlin. I'm being practical." "You're being an idiot," Temperance said, and something in her voice cracked despite every effort she'd made all night to keep it from cracking. "You climb up here every week on knees that shouldn't carry you half that far, because nobody else in this whole valley ever talked to you like you mattered. And you think I'm going to let you lie under a rock because it'd be convenient?" Otis was quiet a moment. "No," he admitted. "I don't suppose you would." The storm broke around dawn, the way storms sometimes do, all at once, like something exhausted itself and simply stopped caring. Temperance walked out to the ledge in the gray early light and looked at what was left. The second cistern had held, mostly. The retaining wall above it had not. Stones scattered down the slope in a scar of raw earth that hadn't been raw the day before. The channel had cut a new path entirely. 3 feet from where they'd dug it, water finding its own stubborn way regardless of what any human hand had decided for it. Weeks of work, undone in a single night. She stood there a long time, arms wrapped around herself against a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. And he let herself feel it. Just for a minute. Because you're allowed a minute even out here, even with a clock running down toward October and a banker waiting to see you fail, and an old man with a broken leg in the chamber behind you who'd trusted his own 2 knees to a climb. He had no earthly reason to keep making except that somebody had finally treated him like he mattered. 1 minute. Then she picked up a shovel. Ezra found her there an hour later, working alone, moving stone that was too heavy for one person and moving it anyway. "You should be resting," he said. "So should you. I slept some." "That's not an answer," she said, echoing words he'd used on her back in April, and something about hearing her own advice handed back made the corner of her mouth twitched despite everything. He picked up a stone, set it where she pointed. "We lost weeks," he said. "We lost weeks. Is that going to matter? With October coming." She stopped, looked at him. He was 14 years old and asking a question a grown man might not have the stomach to ask out loud, and she owed him the truth for it, and the parts of the truth that scared her. "Yes," she said, "it's going to matter." He nodded slowly, didn't flinch from it, which told her something about how much he'd grown since October, more than any measuring mark on a doorframe could have told her. "We work faster," he said. "Then we work faster," she agreed, and they did. Jonah came up 2 days later. Once word of the storm had traveled down into town, and he didn't say much when he saw the damage. Just looked at it a long moment, the way a man looks at a problem he's already started solving in his head before he said a word about it out loud. "I can bring more hands," he said finally. "I don't have money to pay hands." "Didn't say pay," said bring. She looked at him. "Why would anyone climb up here to work for free?" Some. He shrugged, the kind of shrug that carried more weight than the gesture should have been able to hold. "Some might. Depends who's asking and what they think that they owe the person doing the asking." He didn't say more than that. He didn't need to. Within a week, 2 of his cousins had come up on a Sunday afternoon and helped rebuild the wall Otis's stonework had originally shaped, working under Otis's instructions from a blanket on the ledge where he sat with his splinted leg propped up, cursing at the men good-naturedly whenever they set a stone crooked. It wasn't charity, exactly. Temperance understood that by the second day. It was something closer to investment. Men who'd watched a widow build a working water system out of nothing in a valley where their own wells were dropping faster every month than anybody in town wanted to admit out loud. They weren't helping her because they believed in her yet. They were helping her because some starting to hedge their bets against a summer they could feel coming the way you feel weather in an old wound. One evening in early June, the 3 of them sitting on the ledge, as the sun dropped behind the western ridge, Jonah said, quiet, not looking at her when he said it. Creeks dropped again, down at the ford, barely running over the stones. "I know," Temperance said. "How long have you been watching it?" "Since February." He looked at her then. "You said something to Purnell, back in the winter, about his well. I heard about that from Pruitt Word Travels. I wasn't trying to warn him. I was thinking out loud mostly. But you already suspected something was coming." "I thought I did." A pause. "My grandfather's records suggested it. I still hope I'm wrong." Jonah looked back out at the valley, the fields a dull gold in the long summer light that would have been pretty if you didn't know what it meant underneath. "You're not wrong," he said. She already knew that, but hearing it said plain by a man who'd been watching the valley from the ground instead of from a cliff made it land different, heavier, more real. "What's the town saying?" she asked. "Mostly that it'll turn around, that it always turns around." He stretched his legs out in front of him. "Reed's well dropped 8 feet last month. He's not telling anybody. That made me swear not to mention it when I relined the casing for him." "What did you do with that?" "I relined the casing, took his money, went home." He looked at his hands. "Felt wrong, if I'm honest. Man's got a family. His wife doesn't know how bad the well's gotten." Temperance looked at the creek, a thread of it barely visible in the fading light. "There's nothing you can do about that if a man doesn't want to hear it." "No," he agreed, "there isn't." He looked at her sideways. "You've managed to keep doing what needs doing anyway, even with nobody wanting to hear it from either." "I don't have the option of waiting for the right moment," she said finally. "If I'm wrong, I've spent a year and everything I own building something for nothing." She stopped. "If you're right," he finished, "you'll be the only water and food for 20 miles when it matters." She didn't answer that. The sun finished going down, the valley went gray, and then dark, and the 3 of them sat on the ledge until the stars came out and it was time to go in. Otis' legs mended slow through June and slower still through his own stubbornness, which had him trying to stand on it a full two weeks before Temperance thought wise. She caught him twice attempting to walk the terrace wall unassisted, and twice she marched him back to his blanket with a firmness that made Ezra laugh out loud the second time. A sound rare enough that summer, that it made both adults dab like he'd done something remarkable. You laugh at an old man suffering now, Otis grumbled, settling back against the stone. I laugh because you're the stubbornest person I've ever met, and I've met you and my sister both. High praise, Otis said, dry as the creek bed below them. He spent the better part of that recovery propped against the cliff wall in the late afternoons, watching the work he could no longer do with his hands, directing it instead with his voice, which Otis came to understand was his own kind of labor. Harder in some ways than the stonework had been. You're wasting daylight arguing with that wall, he called down one evening, watching Ezra wrestle a stubborn foundation stone into place. Talk to it less. Lean into it more. It won't move. Nothing worth building moves easy, boy. That's how you know it's worth building. One evening, with the light going long and gold across the valley, Otis said something that stayed with Temperance and most of his advice usually did near Ain did. I never had children, he said, apropos of nothing, watching the terraces below them catch the last of the sun. Never had a wife who stayed long enough to want them. Spent my whole life setting stone for other men's houses, other men's barns, never once building anything of my own. You're building this, Temperance said. I'm advising this. Different thing, and we both know it. It's not, though. She sat down beside him on the flat rock that had become, without anyone deciding it formally, his. Every wall on this bluff has your hands in it somewhere, Otis. Every keystone. You think that goes away because you didn't set the facial stone yourself? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice had gone rougher than the evening cold accounted for. Your grandfather used to say something like that, he said, about knowledge outliving the man who carried it. I thought it was a comfort, he told himself, because he didn't have much else left. Now I wonder if he just understood something the rest of us were too proud to learn. What's that? That building something true is its own kind of family, whether blood ever comes into it or not. They sat with that a long while, the going dark below at them, and Temperance thought, not for the first time, that the work on Earth had given her some she hadn't expected to find when she in did over $31.40 for a piece of ground nobody else wanted. It had given her people who wanted to be found by it too. Yalach came up the track again, middle of June, on a morning hot enough that she'd walked the whole way with a shawl held over her head against Jordan. When Temperance meters the cisterns like a girl to clinch herself, walked in and out of the climb a dozen times before finally committing to it. I shouldn't be here, Beulah said by way of greeting. You said that last time too. I mean it more this time. Temperance waited. She'd learned this past year that the fastest way to get somebody talking was to stop filling the silence for them. My father had a visitor last week, Beulah said finally. Late, after the bank closed. A man I didn't recognize come up from the county seat. They talked in his study with the door shut, which he never does, not even for the Reverend. Did you hear any of it? Some, not enough to make sense of. She twisted the shawl in her hands. I heard him say your grandfather's name again, and I heard him say, she hesitated. He said, she's found the carving. I know she has. I can feel it in how she asks questions now. Temperance went very still. What carving? I don't know. I swear I don't. But he said it like it frightened him more than anything else you've done up here, more than the cisterns, more than the terraces. Whatever it is, Mrs. Wray, it's not about money to him. Not really. It's about something he's ashamed of. Temperance thought of the rough, unfinished stretch of stone above the first chamber's entrance, the chute entrance, the section they hadn't yet smoothed because there'd never been time. She hadn't found it yet, not that morning. But some part of her filed the girl's words away regardless. The way you file away a name you haven't needed yet, but suspects that you will. Why do you keep coming up here to tell me these things? Temperance asked. You're risking a great deal. If your father found out, he'd be furious, Beulah agreed. But I keep thinking about something. My mother said once, when I was small, she said the latch name used to mean something different in this valley. Before my grandfather took over the bank, she wouldn't say what she meant by different. She just got quiet whenever I asked. The same way my father goes quiet now. She looked at Temperance directly for the first time since she'd arrived. I think whatever you're looking for It isn't only your family's secret to find, Mrs. Wray. I think it's mine, too. I just don't have the courage to dig for it myself. Then why not just ask him outright? Beulah's laugh was short, humorless. Because he's my father. And because I'm afraid of what it would do to us both if he told me the truth. She pulled the shawl back over her head, preparing to go. I'd rather you find it first. Somehow, that feels safer. Strange as that sounds. Temperance watched her start back down a small, heat-shimmered slope, and she thought, not for the first time, that courage came in more shapes than anybody in Harlow's Creek gave it credit for. Some of it looked like a widow with a chisel. Some of it looked like a banker's daughter walking 2 miles in June heat just to hand a stranger a fragment of a sentence she didn't fully understand herself. It was the third week of June that Temperance sat down with Cyrus's notebooks and did the arithmetic she'd been avoiding since February. She'd tracked the creek level against a stake driven into the bank near the base of the cliff path, marking it weekly since March. She had Jonah's reports on well depths around the valley, casual mentions dropped during evening visits that added up, over weeks, into a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. She had her own morning and evening temperature readings, kept faithfully since the first frost in March, and she had her grandfather's account of 1861 drought. Wells failing by the second summer, families packing wagons and leaving before the second winter arrived. One man driven far enough past reason, eating his own seed corn and having nothing left to plant come spring. She laid it all out on the workbench. A plank across 2 sawhorses that had become the closest thing she had to a desk, and she worked through it line by line, the way her grandfather had taught her to work through anything. Slow, without deciding ahead of time what she wanted to find. What she found frightened her anyway, because the pattern going in this year matched 1861 almost exactly. Poor snowpack, late spring rains that had come thin and left early, a creek dropping below its June baseline before July had even arrived. 14 months if the pattern held. 14 months, starting from a spring that already felt half spent. Which put the worst of it, the true worst, the part her grandfather's described in handwriting that on tight and small with the strain of writing it down at all, landing somewhere in the late summer of the second year. Somewhere around October, she sat very still at the workbench. For a long moment, the notebook open in front of her, the numbers circling in her head like a bird that wouldn't land. 12 months on the debt, 14 months, maybe more on the drought. 2 different clocks, started on 2 different days, for 2 entirely different reasons. Both of them, if her math held, finishing in the same terrible month. July made the arithmetic real in a way numbers on a page never could. Temperance went down into town twice that month for supplies, and both times the change in Harlow's Creek struck her harder than she expected, even knowing what was coming. Even having read her grandfather's account of exactly the stage as over. Knowing a thing was coming and watching it arrive, she was learning, were 2 entirely different kinds of understanding. The creek at the ford had gone from low to bare stone in a matter of weeks. Hollis Reed's South Field, the one he'd been so proud of at planting time, showed round at the edge where the irrigation channel could no longer reach the far rows. Purnell's feed store had a line outside it. Most mornings now, farmers trying to buy grain they couldn't grow themselves. And the prices board had climbed twice since May. Cole Denby found her outside the dry goods store on her second trip, and he didn't have the same bite in his voice, this time that he'd carried up the bluff back in December. You said October, he said. No greeting. I remember. My well's dropped 6 feet since June. He said it plain, no bravado left in it at all. Never dropped that fast before. Not in 11 years farming that ground. Temperance looked at him a long moment. I'm sorry, Cole. Don't be sorry. Just tell me straight. Is it going to get worse before it gets better? She thought about lying to him, about the easier version of the truth, the one that let a proud man keep a little more of his pride through a hard summer. She decided against it. Yes, she said. It's going to get considerably worse. I don't know exactly it turns, but I don't think it's this. She absorbed that the way a man absorbs his blows. He'd been expecting long enough that it barely staggers him anymore. "That cliff of yours," he said. "The water you've got up there. Is it going to hold?" "I'm doing everything I know how to make sure it does." He nodded slowly, looked off toward the dry creek bed a moment, and when he looked back at her, something in his face had shifted in a way she recognized, because she'd seen it happen slowly in Otis, and faster in Jonah, and now, apparently, it was Cole Denby's turn. "I called you a fool back in the winter," he said. "You did. I'm not taking it back yet. Man's got to see a thing through before he changes his mind about it out loud." A pause. "But I'm not laughing anymore either. I want you to know that. I appreciate it." He touched his hat brim, the closest thing to a formal gesture Cole Denby had probably made in years, and walked off toward his wagon without another word. Temperance stood a moment on the dusty street, watching the valley she'd grown up believing was permanent begin, slowly and unmistakably to come apart at exactly the seams her grandfather had marked 60 years before anyone else had thought to look. 2 clocks, still running, neither one slowing down to wait for the other. She found Ezra in the second chamber, running a whetstone along the edge of one of Jonah's chisels, the sound of it rhythmic and dry in the quiet. He looked up when she came in. Read her face this way he'd gotten frighteningly good at reading it these past 8 months. "We need to move up the 3rd cistern," she said. "Start now instead of fall." He set the whetstones down slowly. "We talked about doing that in the fall. I want it now." He'd gotten good in the months they'd lived on this cliff at reading the particular quality of her folks, the way it narrowed when she'd been chewing on something a while and had come out the other side, with a conclusion she wasn't going to move off of. "How bad?" he asked. "I don't know exactly. Bad enough I'm not waiting until fall to find out I was right." He picked the whetstone back up, turned it over in his hands without using it. "Where do you want to sight it?" She spread Cyrus's sketch of the lower slope across the workbench, put her finger on a spot 15 feet below and west of the existing cistern. "There's a secondary spring here. Grandpa marked it seasonal. Runs off snowmelt through midsummer, then dries. It's still running right now. If we get the cistern in while there's flow, we fill it before the seam goes dry, and we've got that water in reserve." Ezra studied the sketch. "That's 2 cisterns. 3, eventually. And I want to double the capacity of the first one while we're at it." Outside, a jay was making a racket somewhere on the slope below, the sharp, aggravated cry of a bird that had found something and then lost it again. "Temperance." His voice had gone quiet. "How long are you thinking this could last?" She looked at the sketch then. At him. 14 months, she said, as level as she could make it come out. "Maybe more." He didn't say anything, just looked at her with the particular expression of someone who'd been hoping, right up until the last second, that she was going to say something else instead. "We'll be all right," she said. "The terraces are producing. The water system's ahead of where I thought we'd be by now, even after the storm. I'm not worried about us. I know we'll be all right." He looked toward the chamber entrance, toward the valley spread out beyond it. "What about them?" She didn't answer that. She folded the sketch, put it in her apron pocket, went back out to the ledge, because that was where the work was. And the work was the only answer she had that didn't require her to lie to a 14-year-old boy about how frightened she actually was. The bank sent a letter in the first week of August. Not a visit. A letter delivered by a boy on a borrowed horse who wouldn't meet her eyes when he handed over, like he already knew what was inside and didn't want to be blamed for the contents. She read it standing on the ledge. The valley spread its gold and dust hazed below her, and by the 3rd line her hands had gone very still in the particular way with is still whenever something required her not to shake. The note was being called, not in October. Now within 30 days. The letter cited a clause she hadn't paid close enough attention to when she'd signed, some language about the property's assessed value needing to remain stable as collateral, and a claim, vague and unproven, that recent flood damage to the site had reduced that value below an acceptable threshold. She read it twice more, standing in the heat, before she let herself feel the shape of what it actually was. It wasn't about the flood. It was about the questions she'd been asking Wendell Pruitt, about a family named Coro, and a fire that had eaten an archive, and 4 letters bleeding through 60-year-old paper that spelled out half of somebody's guilt. Warren Latch was frightened of something, and frightened men, she was learning, didn't wait for a fair fight. They moved the fight up early, while they still believed they held the advantage. She found Ezra at the third cistern site, up to his knees in clay, and she didn't soften the news before she gave it to him, because softening it would have cost him time to prepare that they didn't have to spare. "Leach is calling the note," she said. 30 days. He straightened up slow, wiping his hands on his trousers, and for a long moment, he didn't say anything at all. "He can't do that. You said October. I said what I understood the terms to be. He's found language that says otherwise. That's not fair." "No," she agreed, "it isn't. So what do we do?" She looked down at the valley, at the town sitting small and certain of itself in the afternoon haze, at the bank building square in the middle of it like it had never once had a reason to fear anyone climbing up this hill and asking questions it didn't want. It answered. "We go down there," she said, "and we ask him, in front of as many people as we can manage to have standing around listening. Exactly what's he so afraid we're going to find?" Ezra looked at her. "You think that'll work?" "I think a scared man makes mistakes in front of witnesses that he'd never make alone in a locked office," she said. "I think Warren Latch has spent a very long time being careful, and careful men don't handle surprise well. And if you're wrong?" She thought about that a long moment, thought about $31.40, sold for less than it was worth, and a mule handed over to a man who paid full price because he didn't know how else to apologize for a valley's cruelty. "Then we lose what we've built," she said honestly. "But we lose it having asked the question anyway, and I've decided I'd rather lose it that way than the other way." He was quiet a long moment, looking at her the way he'd looked at her back in October, standing at their father's. No, at Thaddeus's grave, wearing a coat too big for him, working hard not to feel something in front of people who'd talk about it later. "All right," he said finally. "When do we go?" "Tomorrow." That night, before she slept, Temperance climbed to the first chamber and knelt at the entrance where the cliff rose up rough and unfinished above the timber frame. The section they hadn't yet smoothed because there'd never been time, because there was always something more urgent or attention elsewhere. She ran her palm along the stone the way she'd learned to, feeling for the places that were dense and the places that gave, and her fingers caught on something that wasn't rock. A groove old, weathered, dead by years of exposure before they'd framed the entrance and given it shelter. She got the lamp closer, angled the light along the surface the way she'd learned from mate against a scraped page, hunting a shape that wanted to stay hidden. Letters. Carved, not scraped. Deliberate. Half buried under 60 years of wind and rain, but still legible if you knew to look, if you held the light at exactly the wrong angle to see it clean and exactly the right angle to see it at all. CORROW. And beneath it, smaller, half worn away. Never again. Temperance sat back on her heels in the lamplight, the whole chamber gone very quiet around her, the wind outside picking up soft against the timber frame like the bluff itself was holding its breath along with her. Somebody had stood in this exact spot, 60 years ago or more, carved their family name into the stone with their own hands, carved 2 words underneath it that weren't a boast. They were a warning. And whatever had happened to make a family carve never again into the rock they'd loved enough to name. Temperance understood, kneeling there in the lamplight with 30 days, on a bank's clock and 14 months on a drought's, that she was standing in the middle of it now, whether she'd chosen to or not. She didn't sleep that night. She sat with the lamp burning low, one hand pressed flat against the carved letters, and she thought about tomorrow and the letter in her apron pocket, and a banker who'd been careful for 60 years, finally about to meet someone patient enough and desperate enough to stop being careful back. Ezra found her there at first light, and he didn't ask what she'd found. He just looked at the carving, looked at her face, and sat down beside her without a word because some weren't sick. That was the only comfort either of them had left to offer. "Ready?" she asked, once the sun had climbed high enough to make the question honest. "Us?" "No," he said. "Me neither." She stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, picked up the letter, folded tight in her pocket, right beside the notebook page with 4 ghost letters bleeding through it. "Let's go anyway," she said, and they went. Down the track, past the second cistern still healing from the storm, past the terraces climbing green and stubborn up a slope. Everyone in that valley had once agreed could never hold a single living thing. The bank sat on the corner of Main Street the way it always had. Square ends, solid and certain of itself, and by the time Temperance reached the steps, word had already traveled ahead of her, the way word always did in Harlow's Creek. Faster than any letter. Carried on none but the particular hunger a small town has for watching somebody else's trouble unfold in public. A dozen people had gathered by the time she pushed the door open. Pernell from the feed store. Cole Denby, arms crossed, and Prius of a man who'd promised himself he'd remember a date and was pleased to see it arriving early. Ruth Calden, drawn out of her boarding house by the same instinct that draws anyone toward the sound of a fight before it's even started. Warren Latch stood behind the counter, and something in his face went carefully blank the moment he saw her. The particular blankness of a man rehearsing calm he didn't actually feel. "Mrs. Wray, I wasn't expecting. You called my note early," Temperance said, loud enough to carry to the back of the room, because she wanted every single person standing there to hear it plain. 30 days. Citing flood damage that a storm caused, not me. I'd like to know why. The terms of the loan are quite clear. The terms of the loan gave me until October. You know that. I know that. Everyone standing in this room watched me sign that paper at your own recorder's office. A murmur went through the small crowd. Latch's jaw tightened. Circumstances change, Mrs. Wray, do they? Or is it that I've been asking Wendell Pruitt some questions you'd rather I didn't ask? The room went very quiet. I don't know what you mean. I think you do. She stepped closer to the counter, close enough that only he could hear the next part clearly, though her voice didn't drop nearly as low as the moment probably called for. "I think you know exactly what I mean, Mr. Latch. I think you've known since the day I bought that cliff that I was going to find something up there you'd rather stayed buried." His hand, resting flat on the counter, curled slowly into a fist. "You're overwrought," he said. "Grief does strange things to a young woman's imagination." "I'm not overwrought. I'm patient. There's a difference, and I think you're about to learn it." She reached into her pocket, not for the letter, for the notebook page, the one with 4 scraped letters, bleeding faint through 60-year-old Erper, and she set it flat on the counter between them where anyone leaning close enough could see it. Latch looked down at it, and Temperance watched something happen in his face that she would remember for rest of our research. Not fear exactly, not yet, but the particular flicker of a man in realizing all at once that a door he'd spent 60 years believing was locked had just swung open a crack in front of witnesses, and there was no way now to close it back up quiet. "Where did you get that?" he said, and his voice had lost every trace of the careful calm it started with. "My grandfather's notebook. Somebody scraped these pages a long time ago. Somebody who didn't want whatever he'd written here to ever be read again. That's an old page. It doesn't prove anything. It doesn't need to prove anything. Not yet." She let that sit a moment, let the room feel the weight of it. "I found something else too, Mr. Latch, carved into the stone above my chamber entrance, a name Coro, and 2 words underneath it that somebody meant as a warning 60 years before I ever climbed up there to hear it." Cole Denby, near the back, said something too low for Temperance to catch, but she saw Pernell lean toward him, and she saw the way the whole room shifted its weight, the way a crowd does when it senses a story bigger than the one it came to watch. Latch's face had gone the color of old paper. "You don't know what that name cost my family," he said, so quiet that for a moment Temperance thought she'd imagined it. Then, louder, catching himself, hearing his own words land in front of a room full of witnesses and trying too late to pull them back. "I mean, I don't know what you think you've found. I don't know what game you think you're playing, Mrs. Wray, but I assure you—" "I'm not playing a game," Temperance said. "I'm asking a question you've spent 60 years hoping nobody would ever get close enough to ask. And I think, judging by your face just now, that the whole room just watched you almost answer it." The silence that followed had a different texture than the one before. Not curious anymore. Something closer to suspicion. Turned slowly, for the first time in Temperance Wray's memory, away from her and toward the man behind the counter instead. Latch straightened coat. Composed himself with visible effort. "The note stands," he said, his voice regaining its practiced flatness, though his hands were not quite steady on point where they gripped the counter's edge. "30 days, Mrs. Wray. I'd suggest you spend them working instead of digging up ghosts." "I intend to do both," she said, "though you'll find I'm capable of more than one thing at a time." She picked the notebook page back up, folded it with care, and turned to leave. The crowd parting for her the way a crowd parts, for someone it isn't sure, yet whether to fear or to follow. Ruth Calden caught her arm gently at the door, her voice pitched low, meant only for Temperance. "I don't know what that was about," Ruth said, "but I've known Warren Latch 11 years, and I have never once seen him look like that." "Like what?" "Like a man who just realized the ground under his own feet isn't as solid as he's spent his whole life telling everyone it was." Outside, the sun hit hard after the dim of the bank, and Ezra fell into step beside her, quiet, his face working through something he hadn't found words for yet. "You think he'll try something," he said finally, "before the 30 days are up. I think a man who says a sentence like that in front of a room full of witnesses isn't thinking clearly anymore," Temperance said. "I think a man who isn't thinking clearly is more dangerous, not less. So, what do we do?" She looked back once at the bank behind them, at Warren Latch's shape still visible through the front window, standing very still behind his own counter, staring down at nothing. "We go back up the bluff," she said, "and we finish what we started, because whatever he's hiding, Ezra, whatever cost that family their name and cost this valley the truth about it for 60 years, I don't think 30 days is going to be enough time for him to bury it any deeper than it already is." They walked home in the long gold light of a June afternoon, past a creek running thinner than it should have, past fields that were already, if you knew who, looked beginning to show the first honest signs of the hard year Cyrus Marrow had warned about from beyond his own grave. Behind them, in a bank that had stood solid and unquestioned on that corner for longer than Temperance Wray had been alive. A man who had spent 60 years being careful, alone, with a door he could no longer pretend was closed, and somewhere above them both, carved into stone that predated every ledger in that bank's locked cabinet. 2 words waited in the dark for the rest of the valley to finally understand what they'd meant all along. Never again. 30 days. That was what the letter said. That was the number Warren Latch had chosen. Standing behind his counter with careful cracking at the edges, in front of a room full of witnesses who would talk about what they'd seen for years afterward, regardless of how this ended. But Temperance Wray had learned something that summer that no ledger, no notebook, no scraped page could have taught her on its own. A deadline only frightens the person who believes they're facing it alone. She wasn't. Not anymore. There was Ezra walking beside her with a boy's shoulders that had started, sometime in the last 9 months, to carry themselves like a man's. Theirs was Otis, smasting scrantle but stubborn on his flat rock, ready to shout instructions at any wall that dared settle wrong. There was Jonah, arriving unannounced with tools and silence, and a steadiness that asked for nothing in return. There was a banker's own daughter, walking 2 miles in the heat beams, because some part of her the truth found. More than she wanted, her father protected from it. And somewhere below all of them, a valley that had spent a year deciding what to do with a widow's life was slowly beginning to understand it might need her more than she ever needed its approval. She intended to use every single one of them. 22 days, that's what was left when August tipped over into its second week, and Temperance Wray had taken to counting them the way a woman counts anything she can't afford to lose track of. Not out loud. Just a number that sat behind every other thought she had, the way a held breath sits, a sentence you haven't said yet, because the valley below her wasn't waiting on her clock anymore. It had a clock of its own now, and it was running faster than anybody in Harlow's Creek wanted to admit. The creek at the ford had gone to cracked mud. Reed's wheat had burned in the field before it finished heading out, and down at the Foss place, The same trader who'd bought Temperance's wagon less than it was worth back in October. Her 3 children had gone 2 days without anything but dry cornbread, and what little milk a single half-starved goat could still give. Ezra came back from a supply run with that news, and he set the empty sack down harder than the weight of it should have allowed. "It's bad down there," he said. "You can see it in people's faces. Nobody's laughing anymore. Not about us. Not about anything." Temperance kept working the terrace wall in front of her because her hands needed something to do while the rest of her caught up to what he was telling her. "Foss children," she said. "I gave him what was in my pack. Wasn't much. You did right. It won't last them a week." She went down herself the next morning, before the heat could climb too hard, a small sack of dried beans and a wheel of hard cheese tucked under one arm. The Foss house sat low and quiet at the edge of town. Its dooryard bared dirt where grass should have been, and the woman who answered her knock looked at Temperance a long moment before she found it all. "Mrs. Wray, I heard your children were hungry." Something crossed the woman's face. Pride fighting exhaustion, and exhaustion winning, the way it does eventually in every hard year that goes on long enough. "We're managing. I know you are. I also know managing and eating aren't always the same thing." Temperance held the sack out. "This isn't a hurry. I need somebody I trust to help me with the terraces come harvest. I'll pay in food, same as I would in coin if coin's short." The woman took the sack with hands that shook slightly. Whether from hunger or from the effort of not weeping in front of a near stranger, Temperance couldn't say and didn't ask. "Why?" the woman said finally. "After everything this town said about you." "Because your children didn't say any of it," Temperance said. "And because I don't plan on winning this year by watching my neighbors starve while I keep score of whom more mocked me, and who didn't." She walked back up the track that afternoon, with the sun hammering flat white overhead, and she thought about the 2 cisterns holding steady behind her, and the third one, half finished, spring, feeding it thinner every week, but still feeding it. She thought about the carving above the chamber entrance, Coro, and beneath it, 2 words that had stopped feeling like a warning to her and started feeling more and more like an instruction she hadn't finished reading yet. 22 days on the debt, and no end in sight on the drought at all. Ezra was waiting when she reached the ledge again, and he read her face the way he'd gotten frighteningly good at doing this past year. "We can't feed the whole valley," he said, "even with everything we've built." "You said that yourself, back in the spring." "I know what I said. So what changed?" "Nothing's changed," she admitted. "I still can't feed the whole valley. But I can give people a reason to work alongside me instead of watching me from the bottom of the track. That's worth more than a sack of beans in the long run." "A reason like what?" "A reason to trust me enough to help me find the rest of what's under this bluff." It was Wendell Pruitt who came up the track 2 days later, which surprised her more than almost anything that summer had managed to surprise her, because in 10 months of knowing the man, he had never once climbed higher than the space of the track to hand over a filed deed. He arrived out of breath, a touch clutched against his chest, like it held something that might catch fire if he loosened his grip. "Mrs. Wray." He had to stop and breathe before he could say more. "I need you to see something, before I lose my nerve to show anyone at all." He opened the satchel with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside was a ledger, old, its leather cover cracked and softened with age, the kind of book that had clearly spent years somewhere it wasn't supposed to be found. "Where did you get this?" Temperance asked. "The archive room, the one that supposedly burned." His voice dropped, even though there was nobody within 100 yards to overhear him. "It didn't burn, Mrs. Wray. Not all of it. Somebody moved half those boxes to a false wall behind the filing cabinets before the fire ever started. I found the gap by accident, dusting shelves I hadn't touched in years." He opened the ledger to a marked page. "This is the original loan record for the Coro family, dated 1862. Look at the signature on the foreclosure order." Temperance looked. The handwriting was careful, practiced, and underneath the flourish of the signature, a name she'd expected and one she hadn't. Josiah Latch, Warren's father. Temperance stared at the name a long moment, and something in her chest went very quiet. the particular stillness that arrives right before suspicion becomes a certainty, because suspecting is its own kind of comfort. It leaves room for doubt, leaves room to be wrong and to be relieved about being wrong. Knowing leaves no room at all. He called their note early, Pruitt said. Same clause, nearly the same language your letter used, word for word in places, citing a drop in assessed value after a flood that same spring. Temperance's hands had gone very still. That's not proof of anything by itself, she said, even as something cold and certain settled into her chest. A flood happened. A note came due. That could be coincidence. It could be, Pruitt agreed, except for this. He turned 2 pages forward. A second document, folded into the ledger spine, brittle enough that he unfolded it with the care of a man handling something alive. A survey. Her grandfather's handwriting, unmistakable, even faded, even 60 years old, the same survey that had been scraped from her own copy of his notebook. Where he kept a second copy, Pruitt said. For the bank's own records, back when your grandfather was still doing survey work on commission for them. This is the original, whole, untouched. Temperance read it in the fading light, her heart moving faster with every line, and by the time she reached the bottom of the page, she understood exactly what 60 years of Caramful had spent their whole lives, making sure nobody else ever read. Her grandfather hadn't just surveyed the bluff for rock and soil and terrace potential. He'd found something underneath it. A water source described in terms that made the 2 cisterns she'd already dug look like a child's drawing beside a cathedral. An aquifer he'd written, larger than any he had served in 30 years, of looking fed by snowmelt from 3 separate mountain drainages and sitting almost entirely beneath coral land. Water enough, if his numbers, to cut the whole valley through a drought twice as long as the one bearing down on it now. And beneath that finding, in ink, gone thin with age, one final line, told J. Latch of the discovery, per obligation of commission. He asked, "That I speak to no one, until he had determined the best course for the town. I have my doubts about his intentions. I will keep my own copy, regardless of what becomes of this one." He knew, Temperance said, very quiet. Josiah Latch knew there was enough water under this bluff to save the whole valley, and instead of telling anyone, he tried to buy the lens himself, Pruitt finished. Quiet. Through an intermediary so nobody would ask why a banker suddenly wanted a worthless cliff. The Coro family wouldn't sell, so he called their note instead, forced the foreclosure, took the land as collateral. He looked at her, his face pale even in the warm evening light. Then he couldn't find the water himself, or wouldn't risk the questions it would raise. Once people started asking why he wanted a worthless bluff so badly, so he let it sit. 11 years, waiting for the whole thing to be forgotten. Until I bought it. Until you bought it, Pruitt agreed, and started asking the exact questions his son spent his whole life terrified somebody would ask again. Temperance sat, with the ledger open in her lap, the light going gold and low across a valley that had no idea yet what was buried beneath the ground. Children's its own ticketed ones oint. Backbar before named Coro had been driven out for the crime of owning something a banker wanted for himself. Why didn't the Coro family fight? She asked. They tried. County records show a formal protest, filed and denied within a week. Latch controlled the recorder's office by then, controlled most of the county judges too, one way or another. Pruitt's voice had gone rough. The family left within the month. Nobody in this town ever asked where they went. It was easier not to. Hot Temperance thought of Beulah, walking 2 miles in June, heat to heat, a hand stranger, half a sentence she didn't fully understand. Thought of the carving above her own chamber entrance, weathered but legible if you knew to look. Never again. Not a warning aimed at outsiders. A promise the Coro family had made to themselves. On their way out of a home a box had stolen from them, that whoever came after them would know the truth, even if they never got the chance to tell it themselves. "I need this ledger," Temperance said, "and I need you willing to say what you just told me out loud in front of the whole town." Pruitt went very pale. "That could cost me everything, Mrs. Wray." "I know, I have a family. I know that too." She held his gaze steady, the way she'd learned to hold gazes this past year with men who expected her to look away first. "I'm not going to pretend the risk isn't real, but I think you've been carrying a secret nobody deserved to carry alone for a very long time, Mr. Pruitt. And I think some weights only get lighter once you finally put them down where somebody else can see them too. He was quiet a long moment, the ledger slightly in his hands. 22 days, he said finally. That's what's left on your note. 20 days now. Then we'd best not waste any more of them. The night before the meeting, Temperance couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark going over what she'd say, rehearsing it. Except every version came out wrong, somehow too angry or too careful. And she'd start again from the beginning, because a room full of people who'd spent a year calling her strange wasn't going to hand her their trust just because she stood up and used her grandfather's careful words, which meant she needed something else. Something they couldn't argue with, until she remembered she already had it, folded flat in a satchel by the door, and the remembering didn't calm her the way it should have. Except it wasn't really the ledger keeping her awake. She understood that somewhere past midnight, staring at the timber overhead, it was the fear underneath the ledger. That she'd stand up in front of that whole church, and something would go wrong. Some small thing, a word misremembered or a page out of order, and Warren Latch would find the gap and slip through it. And everyone would go back to believing exactly what they'd believed in October, that she was the fool on the hill. Because that fear had never fully left her, not once, not through all the terraces and all the cisterns and all the months, proving herself with her own two hands. It just went quiet. Sometimes. Let her forget it was there. Tonight it wasn't quiet at all. She got up before dawn anyway, splashed cold water on her face from the basin, told her reflection in the dim half-light of the chamber that fear wasn't the same thing as being wrong, and that Cyrus Merrow had been afraid too, most of his life, and had spoken the truth out loud regardless. It didn't fix the fear. It got her moving anyway, which was, she'd learned this past year, most of what courage actually was. The town meeting happened on a Thursday, called not by the mayor or the church, but by word passed hand to hand through a valley desperate enough to gather for almost any reason that promised answers. They met in the largest space Harlow's Creek had. The church itself, pews filled past capacity, men standing along the back wall with their hats in their hands. Warren Latch sat near the front, flanked by two men from the county seat. Temperance didn't recognize. His face set in the same careful blankness she'd watched crack once already that summer. She stood at the front with the ledger in her hands, and Wendell Pruitt beside her, pale but upright, and Ezra in the pew where she'd see him, and Otis leaning on his cane near the door, having made the walk down from the bluff on a leg that still wasn't fully healed, because he'd refused, flatly, to miss this. Her hands were shaking, because they were. No use pretending otherwise, not to herself, the two ceased before she had to open her mouth in front of every person who'd ever called her the cliff witch behind a raised hand. She pressed the ledger flat against her ribs to steady them and thought, absurdly, of Otis on his flat rock, telling her nothing worth building moves easy, and of Ezra's face, the morning he'd asked her whether October was going to matter, and she'd told him the truth instead of a comfort. Which was a strange thing to be thinking, which had nothing to do with anything happening in this room. Except it did, because everything that had happened since that October morning had been leading one stubborn stone at a time to exactly cracked now in one of this many people. Some part of her feared the whole year's work would crack right along with it. It didn't crack. I'm not here to ask for your sympathy, she began, and her came out steadier than she'd believed it could. It carried clean through a room gone dead silent. I'm here to tell you what's been buried under this valley for 60 years, and why a man in this room has spent that entire time making sure none of you ever found out. She told them the foreclosure, the forged justification, the Coro family, driven from land that had been theirs for the crime of refusing to sell a secret they didn't even know they were sitting on, the archive that hadn't really burned, the scraped pages in her grandfather's notebook, the survey Josiah Latch had buried instead of sharing, because sharing it would have meant admitting what he'd done to get it. There is water under Coro Bluff, she said, and felt the room shift at the words, a low murmur running through pews that had spent this whole summer watching their own wells go dry. Enough water, according to my grandfather's survey, to carry the entire valley through a drought twice this length. It's been sitting there the whole time, untouched. Because one man decided the truth was more dangerous to him than the suffering it could have prevented. Latch stood, finally, his composure cracking wide open in front of the whole town at once. "This is slander," he said, his voice too loud, too fast. "A forged ledger, a dead man's notebook. You expect this town to believe. I expect this town to look at their own dry wells," Temperance said, and ask themselves who's had more reason to lie to them this summer, me or you. The silence that followed had teeth in it. Hollis Reed stood slowly from his pew, his face weathered and grim. "My south field burned to nothing this year," he said, not shouting, just loud enough to carry. "My children have gone hungry twice since June, and you're telling there's been water," I'm going to say, Seville sitting under a hill. "You made sure nobody bought for 11 years. Latch's mouth opened. Nothing useful came out of it. One of the two men from the county seat rose instead, smoothing his coat, his voice pitched to sound reasonable in a room that had stopped being interested in reasonable several minutes before. "This ledger proves nothing conclusively," he said. "A signature. An old survey. Mrs. Wray is a grieving widow with an understandable grudge against the institution that holds her note. I'd ask this town to consider the source before." "The source," Wendell Pruitt said, finding a steadiness in his own voice that surprised even him, judging by the way his hand tightened on the pew in front of him, "is the county recorder's office, which is to say, me. I've kept this town's records for 11 years, and I've never once lied about what's in them. I'm not about to start today in front of God and everybody to save a man who let a family farm starve. I thought I was about to keep a secret." The county man sat back down. He didn't try again. Cole Denby stood next, and his voice, when it came, was rougher than Temperance had ever heard it. "I called her a fool," he said, not looking at Latch at all, looking instead at the room full of neighbors who'd laughed along with him back in December. "Called her worse behind her back more than once, and the whole time it was you." He turned finally, and the look on his face made even the two strangers from the county seat shift uncomfortably in their pews. "It was you the whole time, Latch." Beulah Latch last near the back of the church, and when she spoke, her voice shook but didn't break. "He said something to me," she said, loud enough that every head in the room turned toward the girl nobody expected to speak at all. "In June, about Mrs. Wray finding a carving. About being afraid of what she'd feel and how she asked her questions. She looked at her father, and something had become past fear into something harder, something closer to grief. I didn't understand what he meant then. I understand now." Warren Latch looked at his daughter for a long moment, and whatever was left of the careful man who'd worn the same gray coat to every funeral in Harlow's Creek for 11 years seemed to finally, visibly, come apart. He sat back down, said nothing more. The room didn't need him to. The meeting broke up slow, the way gatherings do, when the news is too large to leave all at once. People lingered in small clusters outside the church, talking low, and Temperance noticed more than one neighbor who wouldn't meet her eyes that summer. Finding her now, extending a hand, saying words that came out clumsy, but meant. She walked home that evening with Ezra beside her and Otis a few steps behind, his cane finding the dark path from long practice, and none of them said much until they'd nearly reached the ledge. "You did it," Ezra said finally. "We did it. You. Pruitt." Beulah standing up in front of a room that could have made her life very hard for someone to see what she sees. Temperance shook her head slow. "I just held the ledger. You held it steady, though. That mattered." She thought about that. The valley dark and quiet below them. No lamps lit yet in most of the windows, because most families still couldn't spare the oil. "It doesn't fix anything yet," she said. "The wells are still dry. The debt's still on paper until the board acts. We still have to find the water, Ezra, and prove it's real, and get it flowing before winter, or tonight was just a good story, with no ending." "You think it's really down there?" "I think my grandfather never once wrote something down he wasn't certain of. I think Josiah Latch was frightened enough of it to steal a family's land over it. I think that's about as close to certain as this world generally allows a person to get. Otis caught up to them, breathing hard from that transaction, lowered himself onto his flat stone with a groan that had less to do with pain tonight than with simple exhaustion. Best speech I've heard in this valley in 40 years, he said. And I've heard a great many speeches, most of them considerably worse. High praise, Temperance said, echoing his own words back at him from earlier that summer. Earned praise, he corrected. There's a difference, and we both know it. They found the water 11 days later, on a morning bright enough that the valley below looked, for one strange hour, like it had never known a drought at all. Otis had insisted on being there, leg or no leg, and Jonah had come up before dawn with 2 of his cousins, and every tool his forge could spare. Cole Denby brought his own crew, unasked, and Hollis Reed's men worked alongside them, without needing to be told twice what was at stake. They dug at the site Cyrus Merrow's restored survey marked, 40 feet below the 3rd cistern, following a fracture line in the limestone that Otis read with his hands the same face in. Temperance had learned to read stone from him nearly a year before. The work was slow, slower than anybody wanted, with the whole valley waiting on the outcome, and the 3rd of Latch's 30 days already gone. Twice the fracture line seemed to vanish entirely into solid rock, and twice Oceanus made them stop, made them feel the stone all over again, instead of forcing a path through it out of impatience. They found the true opening an hour past that, a hairline seam Ezra spotted before anyone else, running behind a shelf of rock that looked to every other eye there exactly like the solid stone around it. Here, he said, tapping the rock with the handle of his own hammer, an echo of the gesture Otis had taught him. Sound like knocking on a good door solid. But listen underneath it. He knelt, pressed his palm flat against the stone the way his sister had taught him back in November, back when none of this had a name yet beyond a widow's grief and a cliff nobody wanted. There's something moving under there, he said, wonder cracking his voice wide open. I can feel it. Jonah worked the widening of the seam with the care that surprised Temperance, who'd watched him handle iron and stone, both with a steady confidence all summer. He tapped, listened, tapped again, adjusting the angle by degrees so small she couldn't have named them, until a fine spray of water began to weep from the crack, cold enough that the men nearest it flinched back on instinct. That's it, Otis said, his voice gone rough. That's the seam. How much more? Temperance asked. Not much. Careful now. This next part could go wrong fast if we're greedy about it. They broke through just after noon. Water came up out of the rock in a rush that startled every single person standing near the opening, a cold, clean surge that filled the cavity faster than anyone had prepared for, and for a moment nobody said anything at all. They just stood there, soaked to the knees in water that hadn't seen daylight in a long any of them alive, and let it soak into clothes that had gone dry stiff from a summer with almost nothing left to spare. Jonah was the one who finally spoke, his voice rough with something Temperance hadn't heard in it before. Your grandfather was right, he said, about all of it. He usually was, Temperance said, and felt her own voice go thin, because 19 years of being the only one who ever sat still long enough to listen to a lonely old man's theories ears then had finally, in this one impossible moment, been proven worth every hour of it. Ezra stood at the edge of the new spring, water soaking his boots, and looked at his sister with the expression she would carry with her the rest of her life. He'd have liked this, he said. He would have had 17 suggestions for doing it better. Ezra laughed, really laughed, the sound rare enough that summer it made Otis despite himself, leaning on his cane at the edge of the water. Yeah, Ezra said. He would have. The rain came 3 weeks later, the first real rain the valley had seen since March. It arrived at night, the way the important weather always seemed to in that country, and Temperance woke to the sound of it against the timber. Before she understood what she was hearing, she lay still a long moment, listening, and then she got up and went to the chamber entrance and stood there in the dark with her barefoot feet on the cold stone and let it fall on her face. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of violent, redemptive downpour that exists in stories where the world arranges itself nightly around. Whoever even went longest to deserve it. It was just rain, Ordinary rain, smelling of wet dust and cold, and the particular mineral scent of water, finally meeting stone that had gone 14 months without it. But her eyes stung standing there, and she didn't try to explain that to herself. And she didn't do anything about it either. She just stood in the entrance and let it happen. Ezra appeared in her. She might raised half a slight stance at her shoulder, watching the water run off the cliff face. She indicated down into the cisterns, down into the New Springs Basin, doing exactly what it was built to do. "Is it enough?" he asked. "Not yet," she said, "but it's a start." He went back to bed. She stayed a while longer, watching the system work, feeling something still in her chest that had been holding its breath since October. By then, the shared distribution channel you.You and Hollis Reed had engineered together was already carrying water from the New Spring down into the valley's driest fields, a network of hand-dug troughs and salvaged pipe that would ultimately become the backbone of every farm within 5 miles of Coral Bluff. Warren Latch resigned his position at the bank before the county could force the matter formally. The board that replaced him, Hollis Reed among them, at the town's insistence, voted within its first month to forgive the remainder of Temperance's note entirely, and beyond that, to draw up a formal easement, filed and witnessed and impossible to quietly bury the way the last one had been, guaranteeing every family in the valley permanent access to the water beneath Coral Bluff. Wendell Pruitt kept his position at the recorder's office. Nobody ever brought up costing him his job again. Not once, not even the 2 strangers from the county seat who left town within the week and never returned. The wedding was in October, on the ledge, because there was no other place that would have made sense for it. Otis walked without his cane for the first time since Tastur Stats May, slow but steady, and sat on the flat stone that had become, without anyone deciding, it formally, permanently. Cole Denby brought a pot of stew that fed the whole gathering twice over. Ruth Kuldun spent the week before quietly reorganizing the food stores on the ledge with a thoroughness nobody had asked for, and everybody was grateful for anyway. Purnell came too, which surprised Temperance more than almost anyone else's presence that day. He stood at the edge of the gathering a while, turning his hat in his hands, before he finally worked up whatever nerve the climb hadn't already cost him. "I said things about you I've got no excuse for," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "My boy learned it from somewhere, and I expect that somewhere was me." "I remember," Temperance said. She didn't soften it, and she didn't need to. "I'm not asking you to forget it." He turned the hat over once more. "Just wanted you to know, I see it plain now, what you built, what it took. Thank you for saying so." He nodded, awkward, and retreated toward the food before either of them had to find more words for it. It wasn't forgiveness, exactly. It was something smaller and more honest than that, an accounting, offered without expecting anything back for it. And Temperance decided, watching him go, that it was enough. Jonah Kestrel stood across from Temperance in the October light, his wide hands holding hers, the permanent trace of soot along his jaw, looking for once less like a splash and more like something earned. Ezra stood beside her, wearing a coat that actually fit him. A coat Jonah had quietly commissioned weeks before, without telling either of them till the morning of. Neither Temperance nor Jonah said anything they didn't mean. That seemed, to both of them, the only correct way to begin. Afterward, when the food was gone and the light had turned long and gold across a valley, that finally, after 14 brutal months, had begun to green again, Beulah Latch found Temperance sitting alone at the edge of the ledge. "I wanted to say something," Beulah said, "before I lose the nerve. You've never lost your nerve with me yet." Beulah almost smiled at that. "My father's leaving the county," she said. "Next month's. I'm staying." She looked out at the valley, at the terraces gone green again, at the thread of the creek running full for the first time in over a year. "I want to work the recorder's office, if Mr. Pruitt will have me. I want to make sure nothing like what the Carho family, what almost happened to you, ever gets buried quiet again. Not while I'm the one keeping the records." Temperance looked at her a long moment. "Your father would have hated hearing you say that." "I know," Beulah said. "That's rather the point." Years later, when people in Harlow's Creek told story of the year the creek stopped running, And they told it often, the way any community tells the stories that explain how it became what it is. They called it different things. The hard year, the year of the bluff. Some called it simply the year the truth came up out of the ground alongside the water, because in that valley by then everybody understood. Those two things had never really been separate at all. Ezra went on to survey work of his own in time, carrying his grandfather's oilskin bag and his grandfather's patient habit of reading ground nobody else thought worth reading. He never carved anything into stone the way the Caro family once had. He didn't need to. His work spoke plainly enough on its own, the way honest work generally does, if you give it long enough to be understood. Otis Bramwell lived 4 more years past that. October wedding, long enough to see the 4th cistern finished, long enough to see 2 more families, settle terraces of their own along the easterns where you may use taught Temperance to lean back into the hill instead of fighting it straight. He died in his sleep on his own flat stone, warm afternoon in early autumn, having climbed up that morning under his own power one last time, and nobody who knew him thought that was a coincidence. They buried him on the ledge and made plain and unsentimental years before he ever needed it honored. Whole seasons' worth of hands he'd taught came to stand at the grave. Ezra's, was among them Jonah's, half the valley's, men who'd once called this cliff a fool's errand and now called it something closer to home. Never had children, Temperance said at the graveside, echoing words he'd said to her once on this same ledge, in a summer that felt both impossibly far off and close enough to touch. He was wrong about that. He just never counted and right. On a morning in early spring, some years after the drought had passed into the kind of story children heard about, rather than remembered living through, Temperance left the ledge with a notebook of her own. Not her grandfather's, though she still kept his its pages soft as cloth from 60 years and more of careful hands. Jonah came out of the second chamber with 2 cups of coffee and sat down on flat stone that had once been Otis's, and was by long tradition now simply his. "What are you writing?" he asked. "An observation," she said. He looked out at the valley, terraces catching the morning light, the reservoir 3 years, seasoned and holding steady, children down in town who'd grow up knowing what a water table was and why the ground beneath their feet deserved to be listened to. "Good or bad?" he asked. She thought about her grandfather and his 17 notebook clues nobody had been ready to read in his lifetime. She thought about a family named Coro, who had carved 2 words into stone and trusted the ground to hold their warning until somebody patient enough finally came looking. "Early," she said. "It's still early." She wrote it down, and Jonah didn't press her for more than that, because he learned, same as everyone else on that bluff had learned in their own time, that some observations needed room to sit quiet before but they'd turn into anything worth saying out loud. The morning light came over the eastern ridge and fell across a valley that had learned, at terrible cost, exactly what it meant to listen. And the work, the necessary, unglamorous, ongoing work of a valley finally paying attention to itself, went on.